Hey guys, tonight we begin with something absolutely catastrophic. A time of unrelenting darkness, starvation, plague and despair. We're diving into what life was really like during the year 536 CE, a year that scientists and historians have identified as genuinely the worst year in human history to be alive. Forget the dramatic disaster movies Hollywood keeps recycling. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive a single month in the conditions we're about to explore. So before you get comfy in your bed, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim your lights, get comfortable under those blankets, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up on a cold morning in the year 536 CE, somewhere in the Mediterranean world. The good news is, you survived the night without freezing to death or dying from one of the dozen diseases circulating through your village. The bad news is, the sun hasn't properly risen in weeks, your food supplies are almost gone, temperatures have dropped so dramatically that summer feels like winter, and a plague that will eventually kill half the known world is about to arrive at your doorstep. Welcome to the worst year in human history. Let's start at the very beginning of this nightmare, because you need to understand just how spectacularly everything went wrong. It's early 536, and you wake up one morning to notice something deeply disturbing about the sky. The sun has risen, technically, but it's wrong. There's no warmth reaching your skin, no brightness illuminating your small dwelling. Instead, the sun looks like a pale disk behind a veil, giving off light that seems filtered through thick cloth. You squint at it, this ghostly version of the sun you've known your entire life, and you can actually stare directly at it without hurting your eyes. That's not normal. That's never been normal. You rub your eyes thinking maybe you're still half asleep, that your vision is somehow compromised. But no, your eyes work fine. It's the sun that's broken. You step outside and look around at your neighbors, and you can see the same confusion and growing fear on their faces. Everyone is looking up at the sky, pointing, murmuring, trying to make sense of what they're seeing. The old woman who lives 3 houses down starts crying, convinced this is a sign of the end times. You want to tell her she's being dramatic, but honestly, you're not entirely sure she's wrong. The quality of light is all wrong too. It's not just dimmer, it's different. There's a flatness to it, like everything exists in 2 dimensions instead of 3. Shadows are weak and indistinct. Colors look muted, washed out, like someone threw a grey filter over the entire world. The vibrant blue of the sky is gone, replaced by a sickly greyish haze. The green of plants looks dull and lifeless. Even people's faces look pale and ghostly in this strange twilight that's supposed to be morning. The Byzantine historian Procopius, travelling with the famous general Belisarius through Sicily at this time, describes it as a sun that gave forth light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year. He says it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. But the eclipse never ends. There's no dramatic moment of totality followed by the sun's triumphant return. This is different. This is wrong in a way that makes your stomach clench with primitive fear, because humans are supposed to understand the sun. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun warms, the sun brightens, except now it doesn't. The atmospheric changes are visible even to people with no understanding of meteorology. You can see that the sky isn't right. There are layers of haze visible at different altitudes, giving depth to the greyness above you. Sometimes you can see what looks like clouds, but they're not normal clouds. They're thin, wispy, and they don't move the way clouds should move. They seem to hang motionless in the sky, part of this unnatural veil that's blocking the sun. Birds are behaving strangely too. You notice that the morning chorus of birdsong is muted, confused. Birds that should be singing at dawn are silent or singing at the wrong times. Migratory birds seem disoriented, circling in confusion rather than following their usual routes. Even the local sparrows and crows that you see every day are acting odd, gathering in unusual places, making distressed calls. Animals know when something is fundamentally wrong with the world, and right now everything is wrong. You step outside your dwelling, and the world is painted in shades of grey and muted brown. Everything looks flat, 2-dimensional, like a badly painted fresco. There's no Netflix to distract you from this apocalyptic scenery. There's no internet to Google what the hell is happening. There's no news network to tell you that scientists have identified a massive volcanic eruption as the culprit. You just have this dim, oppressive twilight that refuses to lift. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week. The community starts to fracture under the psychological pressure almost immediately. The village elder calls a meeting to discuss what's happening, and the theories range from divine punishment to astronomical disaster to the literal end of the world. Someone suggests it might be a prolonged eclipse, but the village's one educated man who can read a little Latin points out that eclipses don't work that way. Eclipses last minutes, not days or weeks. This is something else entirely, something without precedent in living memory or historical record. Religious interpretations dominate the discussion. The priest insists this is God's judgment, that the community must have sinned grievously to deserve such punishment. He calls for increased prayer, fasting and penance. Some people embrace this explanation eagerly because at least it provides a framework for understanding, a sense that there's meaning, and possibly a solution. If God is punishing humanity, then perhaps humanity can appease God through proper devotion. It's more comforting than the alternative, that this is random natural disaster with no moral dimension whatsoever, but others are skeptical or outright hostile to religious explanations. If God is all-loving, why would he dim the sun and threaten everyone with starvation? What about the children, the innocent, the pious faithful who've done nothing wrong? The theological arguments become heated, sometimes physical. In one neighboring village, you hear that someone was beaten for suggesting that the Christian God was too weak to control the sun, that perhaps the old pagan gods should be propitiated instead. Religious tensions that simmered quietly under the surface of Christianized society suddenly boil over when catastrophe strikes, and everyone is looking for someone or something to blame. The temperature is dropping. You notice it first in the mornings, when your breath creates clouds of vapor that hang in the still air longer than they should in late spring. Your neighbors start talking in hushed, frightened voices. The older folks remember cold years before, difficult harvests, but nothing like this. This persistent, unnatural dimness is unprecedented. Some people start praying more fervently. Others begin to whisper that the end times have arrived, that God is punishing humanity for its sins, that the world is literally ending. And honestly, based on what you can see with your own eyes, they might not be wrong. The economic impacts begin almost immediately. Even before the full agricultural disaster becomes apparent, markets that usually bustle with activity become subdued, tense. Merchants who would normally haggle cheerfully over prices are now grim-faced and suspicious. Some are already raising prices on stored grain, anticipating scarcity. Others are hoarding goods entirely, refusing to sell at any price. You watch arguments break out over transactions that would have been routine last month. Someone accuses a grain merchant of profiteering, of taking advantage of fear. The merchant responds that he's simply being prudent, that he has his own family to feed. Both positions are understandable, and both contribute to the breakdown of normal economic relations. The wealthy start fortifying their estates and stockpiling supplies. Word spreads that the local nobleman has ordered his guards to turn away anyone seeking charity or shelter. He's preparing for siege conditions, treating this crisis like an invasion by an enemy army, which in a sense it is, except the enemy is the climate itself. This creates resentment among common people who feel abandoned by those who should be providing leadership and protection. The social contract between rulers and ruled is based on mutual obligation. But what happens when rulers decide they can only protect themselves? You see the first signs of hoarding behavior in your own community. That neighbor who was always generous, always willing to share, is now very protective of his stores. You catch him moving sacks of grain to a new hiding place, and when your eyes meet, there's a moment of shame and defiance in his expression. He knows it's not the neighborly thing to do, but he also knows that neighborliness doesn't feed starving children. You don't judge him too harshly, because you've been having similar thoughts yourself. What you don't know, what you can't know, is that somewhere far away, possibly in Iceland, possibly in El Salvador, possibly in multiple locations, volcanic eruptions of catastrophic magnitude have occurred. These eruptions have ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that a veil now covers much of the northern hemisphere. This ash cloud is blocking solar radiation, reflecting sunlight back into space before it can warm the Earth's surface. The planet's temperature is dropping by 1.6 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, which doesn't sound like much when I say it like that, but trust me, It's enough to fundamentally break the agricultural systems that keep you alive. The mechanics of what's happening are complex but devastating. Volcanic ash particles, some so small they're measured in microns, are suspended in the upper atmosphere. They're distributed by high-altitude winds, spreading across thousands of miles, creating a global phenomenon from a localized event. The sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor to create sulfuric acid aerosols, tiny droplets that are incredibly effective at scattering and reflecting sunlight. This chemical transformation in the atmosphere is what's creating the persistent dimness that refuses to clear. Different regions experience slightly different manifestations of the phenomenon based on their latitude, local weather patterns, and distance from the volcanic sources. In some areas, the sun is almost completely invisible for weeks. In others, it's merely dim and sickly. Some regions experience an eerie reddish or orange tint to the light, caused by the way volcanic particles scatter different wavelengths. This variability creates confusion because different communities are having slightly different experiences, making it harder to understand that this is a global event with a single cause. The ash itself is falling in some regions, creating new problems beyond the dimmed sun. In areas closer to volcanic sources, there's a steady rain of fine ash that coats everything, gets into food, water, lungs. It's abrasive, damaging to tools and buildings. It contaminates water sources, making them taste metallic and potentially toxic. Animals that graze on ash-covered grass develop digestive problems. The ash can cause respiratory issues in humans, especially children and elderly people whose lungs are more vulnerable. In severe cases, people develop a chronic cough that never quite goes away, their lungs permanently damaged by inhaling volcanic particles. You're watching the beginning of what will later be called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that will persist not just for months but for years, for over a decade. This isn't just a bad season. This is a climate catastrophe that will reshape civilizations, topple empires, and kill millions of people. And you're standing at ground zero, watching the sun fail to rise properly, with absolutely no idea what's coming next. The immediate psychological impact is profound and multifaceted. Humans are deeply connected to natural cycles, to the rhythm of day and night, seasons and solar patterns. When those cycles break, something breaks in the human psyche too. You find yourself feeling disoriented, unmoored from time itself. Without the normal progression from bright morning to midday brilliance to evening twilight, the days blur together. It becomes harder to judge time, to know when to start or end activities, to maintain the normal rhythms of life. Sleep patterns are disrupted for many people. The dim light that persists all day never properly signals to your brain that it's time to be fully awake and active. Then the darkness comes, and it's too dark, too complete, without the gradual transition that normally occurs. Your body's internal clock, evolved over millions of years to respond to solar cues, is receiving confused signals. Some people start sleeping more, retreating into unconsciousness as an escape from the anxiety of waking life. Others develop insomnia, lying awake in the darkness, minds racing with fear about what's happening and what might come next. Children are especially affected by the atmospheric changes. They sense their parents' fear and confusion, even when adults try to hide it. Young children ask questions that adults can't answer. Why is the sun broken? When will it be fixed? Is it our fault? Are we being punished? Parents struggle to provide reassurance they don't feel, to maintain normalcy when nothing is normal, to protect childhood innocence when the world itself seems to be ending. Some children develop anxiety behaviors, nightmares, regression to earlier developmental stages. Others become unusually quiet and withdrawn, sensing that something is terribly wrong, but lacking the framework to understand or express it. The air tastes different too. There's a gritty quality to it, a faint metallic tang that coats your tongue and the back of your throat. Sometimes you notice a thin layer of dust settling on surfaces, dust that seems to fall from the grey sky itself. In China, chroniclers are describing yellow ash-like substance falling from the heavens, dust they can literally scoop up in their hands. That's volcanic ash traveling thousands of miles on atmospheric currents, slowly settling over the entire planet like a death shroud. The dust creates its own set of problems beyond the obvious unpleasantness. It gets into everything: food, water, fabric, your hair, your lungs. You can taste it in your meals, feel it gritty between your teeth. When you draw water from the well, there's often a thin film of dust floating on top that you have to skim off. Your clothes, which you don't wash as often as modern people would, because washing uses resources you can barely afford, accumulate this dust, making the fabric stiff and abrasive against your skin. Respiratory problems increase across the population. People develop persistent coughs that won't go away. The very young and very old are hit hardest, their lungs more vulnerable to the irritation caused by breathing in microscopic ash particles. You hear of children and elderly people dying of what seems like a wasting lung disease, though you have no way of knowing it's caused by volcanic ash damage. To you, it's just another mysterious affliction in a year full of afflictions, and another way the world is trying to kill you. The accumulation of ash on roofs becomes a structural problem in some areas. The weight of the settled ash, especially after it gets wet from rain, can cause poorly constructed roofs to sag or collapse. This is yet another stress on communities that are already stretched to breaking. Yet another thing that requires effort and resources to fix when both are in desperately short supply. Some buildings that were marginal before become uninhabitable, forcing families to crowd in with relatives or neighbors, increasing tensions and facilitating disease transmission. You try to go about your normal routine. You're not dead yet after all. You have work to do, a family to feed, a life to maintain, but everything feels wrong. The chickens in your yard are confused, their internal clocks disrupted by the lack of proper sunlight. They're laying fewer eggs. The crops in the fields around your village are growing slowly, sluggishly, struggling without adequate warmth and light. The wheat stalks are thin and pale. The vegetables in your small garden look stunted, yellowing at the edges. It gets worse. Of course it gets worse. Within weeks you start to realize that this isn't just a temporary phenomenon. The dim sun persists through what should be the height of spring, into summer, through fall. Byzantine scribe Michael the Syrian will later write that the sun became dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. 18 months. Let that sink in. A year and a half of living under a perpetual twilight, watching your world slowly starve and freeze. There's no electric heating to keep you warm. There's no grocery store where you can just buy food when your crops fail. There's no government relief program that's going to show up with emergency supplies. You have what you have, and what you have is rapidly becoming not enough. The grain storage from last year's harvest is your lifeline, and you're watching it deplete faster than it should because you didn't plan for this. Nobody planned for this. Nobody could have planned for this. Your hands are always cold now, even indoors, even when you're working. Your fingers are stiff and clumsy. The perpetual chill seeps into your bones, makes your joints ache. You're burning through firewood faster than normal, trying to compensate for the lack of solar warmth. But firewood is a limited resource too. The forests around your village are being stripped bare as everyone competes for fuel to burn. There's no Amazon Prime to deliver more wood to your door. You either gather it yourself or you freeze. The psychological toll is immense. Humans are diurnal creatures. We're hardwired to respond to bright days and dark nights, to the changing seasons, to the reliable rhythm of the sun. Now that rhythm is broken, and it's breaking something inside you too. You find yourself feeling sluggish, depressed, disconnected. Modern scientists would tell you that you're suffering from seasonal affective disorder on a massive, prolonged scale, that your brain is being deprived of the sunlight it needs to produce adequate serotonin. But you don't know any of that. You just know that getting out of bed each morning feels harder, that the world feels heavier, that hope is becoming a scarce commodity, and this is just the beginning. This is just the setup for what's about to become a cascading series of catastrophes that will quite literally define the worst year in human history. So settle in, because we're about to explore exactly how bad things can get when the sun stops working properly. Now that you've adjusted sort of to living in perpetual twilight, let's talk about what happens when plants don't get enough sunlight. Spoiler alert, it's not good for anyone who depends on plants to survive, which is everyone. You're about to experience famine on a scale that will reshape the demographics of entire continents. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. This isn't opinion. This is basic biology. Without adequate light, they can't convert carbon dioxide and water into the glucose they need to grow. Your crops are trying their best, but their best isn't nearly good enough. The wheat that should be waving in golden fields is instead sparse and stunted. The grains that do form are small, hard, and fewer in number. When you finally harvest what little there is, you're looking at yields that are maybe 40 to 50% of normal. And normal wasn't exactly luxurious to begin with. The physiological process of what's happening to the plants would be fascinating if it weren't so terrifying. Without adequate sunlight, photosynthesis slows dramatically. The plants can't produce enough energy to support normal growth, so they prioritize survival over reproduction. This means fewer seeds, smaller fruits, less of everything humans depend on. The plants are stressed, and stressed plants are more vulnerable to diseases and pests, creating a compounding problem where already reduced yields are further diminished by opportunistic pathogens and insects. You can see the stress in the plants themselves if you know what to look for. The leaves are smaller than normal, sometimes yellowed or discolored, signs of nutrient deficiency caused by reduced photosynthetic capacity. The stems are thinner, weaker, more prone to breaking. Root systems are less developed because the plants don't have the energy to invest in below-ground growth. Everything about the plants signals distress, a desperate struggle for survival in conditions they're not adapted to handle. The timing of the disaster makes everything worse. The volcanic events occurred in early spring, right when crops should be entering their main growth phase. This means the entire growing season is compromised from the beginning. There's no recovery period, no time when conditions improve and plants can catch up. The dim light and cold persist through what should be the peak growing months of summer, creating a scenario where crops never had a chance to develop properly, even if they don't die outright. The vegetables are even worse off. The broad beans that are a staple of your diet are producing tiny, shriveled pods. The onions refuse to bulk up properly. The fruit trees, confused by the cold and dark, either don't blossom at all or drop their blossoms before they can set fruit. You watch apple blossoms fall like snow in the dim light, each one representing food you won't have in the fall. There's no backup plan. There's no saying, well, I'll just order takeout when your garden fails. If it doesn't grow, you don't eat it. The psychological impact of watching your crops fail cannot be overstated. For an agricultural society, crop failure isn't just an economic setback, it's an existential threat. Your entire life, your survival, your family's future, everything depends on those plants growing. You've done everything right, prepared the soil according to traditions passed down through generations, planted at the correct times, tended the crops diligently, but none of it matters, because the fundamental requirements for plant growth, adequate sunlight and warmth, simply aren't there. There's a special kind of helplessness that comes from doing everything correctly and still failing. You can't fix the sun, you can't make it warmer, you can't will your plants to grow through sheer determination. All you can do is watch, and wait, and hope for improvement that isn't coming. This powerlessness eats at you, creates a deep anxiety that never quite goes away, even when you're occupied with other tasks. Some farmers try desperate measures to save their crops, building small fires near fields to provide warmth, though this is expensive and of limited effectiveness, covering vulnerable plants with cloth or straw to trap what little heat exists, though this creates its own problems with moisture and rot, praying over fields, performing rituals that blend Christian practice with older agricultural traditions, calling on every supernatural power that might help. None of it works, of course, but the need to do something, anything, is overwhelming even when you know it's futile. The failure cascades through different crops at different rates. Some plants are more cold tolerant than others, so you see differential failure that creates cruel hope. Maybe the barley will make it even if the wheat doesn't. Maybe the root vegetables will survive even if above-ground crops fail. But as weeks turn to months and the cold persists, even the hardiest crops begin to fail. That last hope of salvaging something from the growing season gradually dies as each crop type succumbs in turn. Ireland is experiencing what contemporary sources call a failure of bread. That's the medieval Irish way of saying everyone is starving. Bread is the foundation of the diet across much of the world right now. It's how you get the majority of your calories. When bread fails, civilization teeters, and bread is failing everywhere, from Ireland to Constantinople, from China to Scandinavia. This is a global agricultural catastrophe. The Irish situation deserves special attention because their chronicles are relatively detailed for this period. Ireland was already a marginal agricultural environment, with thin soils and heavy rainfall making farming challenging in good years. Climate catastrophe of 536 pushes conditions past the breaking point. The cool, dim conditions extend the already short growing season to the point where many crops simply can't mature at all. Fields that were planted optimistically in spring are still showing green, immature plants when autumn frosts kill them outright. The Irish response to famine reveals both the best and worst of human nature. Monasteries, which have better food stores than most communities, open their doors to feed the starving, demonstrating genuine Christian charity, even as their own supplies dwindle. Some nobles share their stored grain, recognizing that their own survival depends on maintaining some minimal level of social cohesion, but others hoard ruthlessly, protecting their supplies with armed guards, letting commoners starve at their gates while they maintain adequate diets for themselves and their households. The failure of bread has symbolic weight beyond its nutritional importance. Bread is sacred in Christian theology, representing the body of Christ in the Eucharist. It's also the fundamental symbol of life, sustenance, civilization in itself. When bread fails, it feels like God has withdrawn his blessing, like the basic covenant between heaven and earth has been broken. This isn't just about calories, though calories matter desperately. It's about the collapse of the symbolic order that gives life meaning. The cold isn't helping. Summer temperatures that should be warm enough to ripen grain are instead hovering at levels that would normally occur in spring or fall. In some areas there's frost in June. Frost in June. Your ancestors passed down agricultural knowledge that's been refined over generations, knowledge about when to plant, when to expect the last frost, when the warm season arrives. All of that knowledge is suddenly useless because the climate you knew has simply stopped existing. The June frost is particularly devastating because it occurs when crops are at vulnerable developmental stages. Wheat and barley are flowering, the critical period when grain kernels form. A single hard frost during flowering can sterilize the entire crop, preventing kernel formation altogether. You wake up one June morning to find your grain fields covered in white frost, and you know immediately that the harvest is lost. Not reduced, not damaged, but completely lost. There will be no grain from these fields this year. The realization hits you like a physical blow, making your legs weak, your vision swim. This isn't just a setback. This is a death sentence for some percentage of your community, possibly including you and your family. The temperature records, as reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores, show truly unprecedented conditions. Average summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere are 2 to 3 degrees Celsius below normal, which translates to roughly 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit for Americans. This doesn't sound dramatic, but it's catastrophic for agriculture. The accumulated growing degree days, the measure of heat energy available for plant development, falls far short of what crops need to mature. It's like trying to bake bread in an oven that never gets hot enough. The bread won't rise, won't cook through, will remain forever underdone. Different regions experience the cooling differently, based on their latitude and local geography. Areas that were already marginal for agriculture, like Scandinavia or highland regions, become essentially unfarmable. Areas that were comfortably agricultural, like France or England, become marginal. Areas that were highly productive, like Italy or Greece, see dramatic yield reductions. The entire agricultural map of the world shifts unfavorably, and every region loses productivity simultaneously, so there's no way to compensate through trade. The persistent cold creates a feedback loop that makes conditions progressively worse. Cold soil warms slowly even when the air temperature rises slightly, meaning root systems remain chilled and inactive. This limits nutrient uptake, further stunting plant growth. Cold, wet soil also promotes fungal diseases that attack plant roots, causing rot and further reducing already limited yields. The crops that survive the cold are weak and vulnerable, prime targets for every pathogen and pest in the environment. In China, the chronicles report yellow dust falling from the sky and frost in the middle of summer. Can you imagine? You're a Chinese farmer. You've planted your summer crops according to the schedule that has worked for centuries, and then in August snow falls. Not a light dusting, actual snow. Your crops, which were already struggling in the dim light, are now killed by frost. The growing season you depended on has vanished. The Chinese historical records from this period are particularly valuable because Chinese civilization maintained bureaucratic record-keeping even during catastrophes. Multiple chronicles from different regions report similar phenomena, giving us a comprehensive picture of what was happening across China. The Nanshi describes dust falling from the sky that was yellow in color and could be scooped up by hand. The chronicles of the southern dynasties report extraordinary weather events including summer frost and August snow. These independent sources corroborate each other, confirming that what sounds impossible really happened. The August snow in China is meteorologically fascinating and agriculturally catastrophic. Snow in August requires sustained below freezing temperatures during what should be the hottest month of the year. This represents a complete inversion of normal climate patterns. The snow doesn't just kill crops directly through freezing, it also prevents any remaining growing time by signaling to plants that winter has arrived. Plants that might have produced some yield if given a few more weeks instead, shut down entirely, triggered by the snow into dormancy or death. The yellow dust phenomenon adds another layer of disaster. This volcanic ash, carried thousands of miles from eruption sites, settles over Chinese agricultural regions, coating everything. It gets into irrigation systems, contaminating water supplies. It covers leaves, blocking what little sunlight penetrates the atmospheric veil, further reducing photosynthesis. It infiltrates grain stores, contaminating food reserves. The dust is everywhere, inescapable, a constant reminder that something fundamental has gone wrong with the world. Chinese farmers try to adapt to the impossible conditions. Some attempt to plant cold-tolerant varieties of crops, though nothing is truly tolerant of August snow. Others try to create microclimate zones using windbreaks and terrain features to trap what little heat exists. Some communities organize work parties to brush dust off crops, a Sisyphean task since more dust falls constantly. These adaptations achieve little, but the effort demonstrates the human refusal to simply accept disaster passively. The city of Xinzhou and surrounding areas are hit particularly hard. Contemporary records suggest that 70 to 80% of the population dies. Read that again. 7 out of every 10 people you know will be dead within 2 years. Not from war, not from an invading army, but from simple starvation and the diseases that accompany malnutrition. Your immune system can't fight off infections when you're slowly starving. A simple cold becomes life-threatening. A minor cut becomes septic. Your body is eating itself, converting muscle tissue to energy because there's no food coming in. The death toll in Jinzhou represents one of the highest mortality rates recorded for any pre-modern famine. To understand what 70 to 80% mortality means, imagine your extended family, your neighbors, everyone you interact with regularly. Now imagine that only 1 or 2 out of every 10 survives. The social fabric doesn't just fray, it disintegrates completely. There aren't enough living people to bury the dead, to maintain infrastructure, to perform the basic tasks that keep civilization functioning. The survivors in Jinzhou face a post-apocalyptic landscape. Villages that once held hundreds of people now have 20 or 30 survivors rattling around in empty buildings. Fields go unplanted because there's no one to plant them. Houses collapse because there's no one to maintain them. The few survivors are traumatized, malnourished, often ill themselves, facing the overwhelming task of rebuilding from essentially nothing. Many don't try. They simply migrate away, seeking regions that were less devastated, leaving ghost towns behind. The mortality pattern in Xinzhou follows predictable stages. First, the elderly and very young die, their bodies unable to cope with severe caloric restriction. Then the sick and weak succumb. Then previously healthy adults begin to die as malnutrition progresses from severe to critical. In the final stages, even the strong die, their bodies having exhausted every reserve, every backup system, leaving nothing to sustain life. The progression is inexorable, predictable, and horrifying to watch if you're among the survivors. The psychological impact on survivors cannot be overstated. Imagine being one of the 20 to 30% who lives while watching 70 to 80% of everyone you know die slowly of starvation. The guilt, the trauma, the sheer weight of that experience would break most people. Some survivors develop a numbed, dissociated affect, emotionally shutting down as a defense mechanism. Others become obsessively focused on food security, hoarding behavior that persists even when conditions improve. Still others simply give up, losing the will to continue in a world that's taken everyone they loved. You know that feeling when you skip lunch and you get a little hungry? Imagine that feeling, but it never stops. It's there when you wake up, a gnawing emptiness in your gut. It's there all day as you try to work in the fields, making you weak and dizzy. It's there at night, keeping you awake, making you irritable and desperate. And every day there's less food available. Every day the portions get smaller. Every day you wonder if there will be anything at all tomorrow. The social fabric starts to fray. People who were neighbors, friends, even family, start viewing each other as competitors for scarce resources. There are reports from various regions of hoarding, theft, violence over food. In some areas, there are whispered rumors of worse things, of people eating things they shouldn't eat, of desperate acts by desperate people. The veneer of civilization is surprisingly thin when everyone is starving. You start to lose weight, obviously. Your clothes hang loose on your frame. Your face becomes gaunt, your cheeks hollow. You can see your ribs clearly when you bathe, which you're doing less frequently because you don't have the energy, and heating water requires fuel you can't spare. Your hair becomes brittle and starts falling out. Your nails develop ridges and split easily. These are signs of severe malnutrition. Your body shutting down non-essential systems to conserve energy for vital organs. Children are suffering the most. Growing bodies need more calories, more nutrients. You watch children in your village with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. The classic signs of kwashiorkor, severe protein deficiency. They're listless, uninterested in playing, too weak to run and laugh the way children should. Some of them won't make it. That's the harsh reality. The very young and the very old are the first to die in famines, and this is shaping up to be a famine for the history books. The animals are starving too. Your livestock, if you're fortunate enough to have any, are struggling. Cows produce less milk because they're not getting adequate nutrition from the sparse pale grass. Pigs, which will eat almost anything, are getting thin. Chickens have mostly stopped laying eggs. These animals represent wealth, food security, your backup plan. Watching them waste away is watching your future disappear. Some people make the desperate decision to slaughter their breeding stock, eating the animals that would have produced more animals next year. It's a choice between starving now or starving later, and now is very persuasive when your children are crying from hunger. But it's a trap. Every breeding animal you eat is food you won't have in the future. You're consuming your seed corn, as the saying goes, mortgaging tomorrow to survive today. The grain stores that villages and cities maintained for emergencies are depleting rapidly. These stores were meant to buffer against one bad harvest, maybe two. They weren't designed to handle 3 or 4 consecutive years of failed crops, which is exactly what's about to happen. By late 536, many communities have already exhausted their emergency supplies. Now it's just a matter of how long people can survive on increasingly creative and desperate measures. People are eating things they wouldn't normally consider food. Bark stripped from trees and boiled into a bitter, barely nutritious pulp. Grass, roots dug from the ground. Leather boiled until it's soft enough to chew. Your diet has become a creative exploration of things that won't immediately kill you if you put them in your mouth. There's no Food Network showing you gourmet ways to prepare tree bark. You're just trying not to die. The wine is terrible. Remember Michael the Syrian mentioning that the wine tasted like sour grapes? That's because the grapes didn't ripen properly in the cold and dim conditions. Wine is important in this era, not just for getting drunk, though that would be nice right about now, but as a source of calories and a way to make questionable water safer to drink. Bad wine means another failure in your food security system. Trade is disrupted. Normally, if one region has a bad harvest, they can import food from regions that did better, but this isn't a localized disaster. This is global. There's no region doing well. Ships that would normally carry grain from Egypt to Constantinople are carrying less grain, or no grain at all, because Egypt doesn't have surplus grain to export. The interconnected trade networks that usually buffer against local shortages are all experiencing shortages simultaneously. You're rationing everything now. That half loaf of bread that would normally be one meal is now stretched across 3 meals. Paper-thin slices that leave you hungry. That's if you have bread at all. Many people are living on thin gruel, mostly water with whatever grain or legumes can be spared. It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. You can feel yourself weakening day by day. There's a particular cruelty to slow starvation. It's not dramatic. You don't just fall over dead one day. Instead, you gradually fade. You have less energy, so you move slower, do less. This means you're less productive, can't work as effectively, can't gather or grow as much food. This creates a vicious cycle, where weakness leads to less food, which leads to more weakness. You're trapped in a downward spiral with no bottom in sight. The psychological impact is devastating. Hunger affects your brain, makes it hard to think clearly, hard to make good decisions. You become fixated on food, dreaming about it, thinking about it constantly. When you do sleep, which is difficult when you're hungry, you dream of feasts that vanish when you wake. The contrast between dream abundance and waking starvation is its own special torture. Some people give up. You see it in their eyes. a hollow emptiness that has nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with despair. They stop trying, stop fighting, just sit and wait for death. Others become frantic, desperate, making poor decisions born of panic. Neither response improves survival odds, but when you're starving, rational thought becomes increasingly difficult. And here's the thing, the really terrible thing. This food crisis doesn't end in 536. The climate disruption persists for years. That volcanic ash isn't going to clear quickly. Multiple eruptions in 536, 540, and 547 keep pumping more material into the atmosphere, extending the late antique Little Ice Age. You're not dealing with one bad year. You're dealing with over a decade of reduced agricultural output, a decade of hunger, a decade of watching the strong become weak and the weak become dead. This is what famine looks like from the inside. This is what it means when historians write about food shortages and agricultural disruption. Those clinical terms don't capture the daily horror of watching your children starve, of feeling your own body consuming itself, of knowing that tomorrow will bring more hunger and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no light at the end of this tunnel, because even the actual light has abandoned you. So you're cold, you're starving, you're living in perpetual twilight, and you think it can't possibly get worse. Congratulations, you've never met the Plague of Justinian. Let me introduce you to the disease that's about to kill somewhere between 30 and 50 million people over the next 2 centuries, starting right here, right now, in your worst year ever. It begins quietly, the way these things often do. Someone in your village develops what seems like a fever. Nothing unusual about that. People get sick all the time. But then they develop this lump, this bubo, usually in the groin, armpit, or neck. It starts small but grows rapidly, swelling until it's the size of an egg, sometimes larger. The skin over it becomes tight, shiny, exquisitely painful. The person can't move without agony. They can't walk, can't work, can barely think through the pain and fever. The development of a bubo is a horrifying process to witness. It begins as a small, hard nodule under the skin, barely noticeable. Within hours, sometimes faster, it swells dramatically. The lymph node, overwhelmed by bacterial invasion, becomes massively inflamed and fills with pus. The skin over the bubo stretches tight, sometimes developing a purplish or black discoloration as blood vessels rupture under the pressure. The victim's body is literally being consumed from within, their immune system's desperate response creating as much damage as the bacteria themselves. The pain of a bubo is described in contemporary sources as unbearable. The infected lymph node is packed with nerve endings, and the pressure from swelling stimulates all of them simultaneously. Victims scream when the bubo is touched. They adopt strange postures to avoid any pressure on the affected area. Some become delirious from the combination of pain and fever, thrashing and crying out incoherently. Others retreat into a state of near catatonia, becoming unresponsive as their minds shut down to escape the overwhelming sensory input. When the bubo bursts, which it often does after several days of swelling, the release of pressure provides momentary relief, followed by new horrors. Thick, foul-smelling pus erupts from the site, sometimes mixed with blood. The discharge is incredibly infectious, teeming with plague bacteria. Anyone who comes into contact with it, anyone who helps clean the victim or change their bedding, is exposing themselves to infection. The smell is indescribable, sweet and rotten simultaneously, a stench that makes people gag and vomit. Some victims develop multiple bupos simultaneously, in several lymph node clusters. This is particularly agonizing and usually fatal. With bupos in the groin, armpits and neck simultaneously, the victim can barely move at all, every position causing unbearable pain. They lie in whatever posture minimizes the pressure, often curled in fetal positions, whimpering or crying out with each involuntary movement. Their suffering is so extreme that death sometimes comes as a mercy. Then more people develop these bupos. Within days, a handful of cases becomes dozens. The bupos aren't even the worst part, though they're bad enough. The fever is intense, the kind that makes you delirious, makes you see things that aren't there. Victims alternate between burning up and shaking with chills. They vomit. They develop a rash that turns into black spots. Hence the later name Black Death. Though this particular outbreak will be called the Plague of Justinian, after the emperor currently ruling in Constantinople. The smell is what you notice first when you enter a house with plague victims. It's a sweet, rotten smell, like meat gone bad mixed with something else, something worse. It's the smell of the buboes when they burst, releasing thick, foul-smelling pus. It's the smell of gangrenous tissue, of bodies starting to rot while still alive. There's no Febreze to mask it. There's no N95 mask to filter it out. You just breathe it in and try not to vomit. Here's what's actually happening, though you don't know it. Bacteria called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that live on rats, are infecting humans. The bacteria multiply in the lymph nodes, those clusters of immune system tissue throughout your body, causing massive inflammation and swelling. That's the bubo. The bacteria then spread through your bloodstream, causing septicemia, blood poisoning. Without antibiotics, which won't be invented for another 1,400 years, your immune system is fighting a losing battle against an overwhelming bacterial invasion. The mechanism of plague infection reveals why it's so deadly. Yersinia pestis has evolved specifically to overcome mammalian immune responses. It produces proteins that interfere with the immune system's ability to recognize and destroy invading bacteria. It forms biofilms in the flea's digestive system, blocking it and causing the flea to regurgitate bacteria when it tries to feed. It survives and multiplies within immune cells that are supposed to destroy it. This bacteria is a highly adapted killing machine, refined by evolution to exploit mammals as hosts. The flea-rat-human transmission chain is perfectly suited for epidemic spread in human settlements. Rats are commensal animals, living in close association with humans, thriving on human grain stores and garbage. Fleas move easily between rats and humans, especially in crowded, unsanitary conditions. When plague kills off the local rat population, the fleas seek new hosts, jumping to humans. This creates waves of human infection that follow the initial die-off of rats, a pattern that would be obvious if anyone understood disease transmission. But no one does. The incubation period for bubonic plague is typically 2 to 6 days after the flea bite. This means infected people feel fine for days while they're already carrying and potentially spreading the disease. They go about their normal activities, interacting with others, traveling to markets or religious services, unknowingly exposing dozens or hundreds of other people. By the time symptoms appear and the person is obviously sick, they've already seeded new infections throughout their community. The survival rate for untreated bubonic plague is roughly 40 to 50%, which sounds better than the other forms but is still catastrophically high mortality. And remember, treatment in 536 CE is worse than no treatment. Bloodletting weakens patients. Hot poultices might burst buboes prematurely, spreading infection. Many remedies involve substances that are either inert or actively toxic. The only treatments that might help marginally are rest, hydration, and keeping the patient clean, but even these are difficult to provide in communities overwhelmed by epidemic. The plague has 3 forms, and you get to experience the lottery of which one you get. Bubonic plague, the most common form, gives you those characteristic buboes. It kills about 50 to 60% of victims if untreated, which it always is in 536. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacteria multiply directly in your blood. This causes your tissues to die and turn black, especially at the extremities. Your fingers and toes literally rot while you're still alive. This form kills close to 100% of victims and kills them fast, often within a day or two. Pneumonic plague happens when the bacteria infect your lungs. You start coughing up blood, spreading the disease through respiratory droplets to everyone around you. This form also kills close to 100% of victims and spreads incredibly rapidly. You don't have any of the knowledge that would help you avoid infection. The concept of germ theory won't be developed for another millennium. You don't know that rats and fleas carry the disease. You don't know that you should avoid contact with sick people and their belongings. You don't know that proper sanitation could reduce transmission. You're operating on medieval medical theory, which is spectacularly wrong about nearly everything. Medieval medicine thinks disease is caused by imbalanced humors, bad air, divine punishment, or malign planetary alignments. Treatment involves bloodletting, which weakens already sick people. Application of heated onions or frogs to the buboes, which does nothing. Prayers and religious rituals, which provide psychological comfort but no medical benefit. Some physicians recommend inhaling pleasant aromas to counteract the bad air causing the plague. Others suggest balancing your humors through diet. None of this works. People die anyway, in droves, and medical practitioners die right alongside them because they're in constant contact with infected patients. The plague hits Constantinople particularly hard. This is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a crowded city of hundreds of thousands of people living in close quarters. It's the perfect environment for disease transmission. Emperor Justinian himself catches the plague, but, in a stroke of luck, survives. Most people aren't so fortunate. At the height of the outbreak in Constantinople, contemporary sources claim that 5,000 to 10,000 people are dying per day. The bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. Initially, there's an attempt at proper burial. Bodies are taken to cemeteries, religious rites are performed, graves are dug, but the scale of death quickly overwhelms these civilized practices. Soon bodies are being thrown into the sea, dumped in mass graves, left rotting in the streets. The city becomes a charnel house. The smell of death is everywhere, inescapable. Ships arriving in harbor report smelling Constantinople before they can see it, the stench of decaying human bodies carrying for miles on the wind. The social order collapses under the weight of mass death. Who's going to maintain law and order when the guards are dying? Who's going to grow food when the farmers are dead? Who's going to conduct trade when merchants are too afraid to enter plague cities? The economy grinds to a halt. Fields go unplanted. Shops close. The streets that used to bustle with commerce and life are now mostly empty, except for the occasional person hurrying past, trying not to breathe too deeply, trying not to look at the bodies. Emperor Justinian orders the bodies removed from Constantinople. Great idea. Except now you need people to handle the infected corpses, and handling infected corpses is an excellent way to catch plague yourself. The workers tasked with body removal are essentially being sent to their deaths. Many of them know it. Some desert their posts. Others demand higher wages, hazard pay for literally risking their lives. The authorities agree because what choice do they have? The bodies have to go somewhere. Mass graves are dug outside the city. Enormous pits into which hundreds of bodies are dumped like garbage. There's no individual burial, no tombstone, no marker, just layers of corpses covered with dirt, anonymous in death, their lives reduced to another tally in the death count. If you die of plague in 536, there's a good chance your final resting place will be an unmarked mass grave, and no one will remember your name. The plague doesn't discriminate. It kills peasants and nobles, children and adults, the healthy and the already sick. Your social status, your wealth, your piety, none of it matters to Yersinia pestis. The bacteria doesn't care if you're a good person. It just replicates and kills. There's something democratizing about plague. A grim equality in the face of mass death. Everyone is vulnerable. Everyone is afraid. Living through plague means living with constant fear. Every fever, every headache, every swollen lymph node could be the beginning of the end. You examine your body obsessively, searching for buboes. You avoid other people as much as possible, but in a tight-knit agricultural community, complete isolation is impossible. You need to trade for food, draw water from the communal well, attend necessary gatherings. Each interaction is a gamble with death. Families are torn apart. When one member develops symptoms, the others face an impossible choice. Stay and care for them, likely catching plague yourself, or abandon them to die alone, preserving your own life but living with the guilt forever. There's no good answer. People make different choices, and all of them are tragic. Children are orphaned by the thousands. Parents die, and there's no social services to step in, no foster care system, no orphanages with the capacity to handle the influx. Orphaned children either survive on the streets through begging and theft, are taken in by relatives who can barely feed their own families, or die of starvation or disease themselves. The plague is creating a generation of traumatized, parentless children who will carry the scars of 536 for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll is immense. Humans aren't designed to process death on this scale. We can mourn one person, maybe a few people, but hundreds, thousands, your brain can't comprehend it. Death becomes routine, normalized, just another part of daily life. You become numb to it, and that numbness is its own kind of trauma. You're alive, but you're not really living. You're just surviving, day to day, waiting to see if today is the day you develop that fever, that telltale bubo. Some people respond to plague with increased religious fervor. Churches are packed with people praying for deliverance, for divine intervention to stop the dying. Processions wind through city streets, people flagellating themselves, begging God to lift this punishment. If God is punishing humanity for its sins, maybe greater piety will appease him. It doesn't work. People die during religious services. Priests die while administering last rites. The churches themselves become vectors of disease transmission. But people keep coming because what else can they do? Others respond with hedonism. If death is coming anyway, why not enjoy what time remains? There are reports of increased drinking, gambling, sexual license. When tomorrow might never come, conventional morality loses its grip. Why save money for the future when there might not be a future? Why maintain your reputation when everyone might be dead in a month? Social norms fray as people embrace a kind of apocalyptic fatalism. The plague also spreads along trade routes, carried by merchants, soldiers and refugees fleeing infected areas. Ironically, fleeing plague often means spreading it to new regions. That ship full of refugees from Constantinople, they're bringing plague to every port they visit. Those soldiers returning from military campaigns, they're walking biological weapons, infecting their home cities. The interconnected Roman world that facilitated trade and communication is now facilitating the rapid spread of disease. In some regions, entire villages are depopulated. Everyone either dies or flees, leaving behind empty houses, unplanted fields, ghost towns that will never be reoccupied. Years later, travelers will pass through these abandoned settlements, seeing the remains of lives interrupted, furniture still in houses, tools still in workshops as if everyone just vanished one day. Which, in a sense, they did. The economic impact is staggering. The Byzantine Empire loses between 35 to 55% of its population. That's not just a humanitarian disaster, it's an economic catastrophe. Half your taxpayers gone, half your soldiers dead, half your workforce vanished. The empire was already struggling to restore Roman glory, fighting expensive wars of reconquest against Goths, Vandals and Persians. Now those military campaigns grind to a halt because there aren't enough soldiers, and the ones you have are dying of plague. Agricultural production plummets even further than the climate disaster had already reduced it. Dead farmers don't plant crops. Fields that were already marginal due to the cold and dim conditions now go completely uncultivated because everyone who knew how to farm them is dead. The food situation, already dire, becomes catastrophic. The plague will recur. This isn't a one-time event. The Plague of Justinian will come in waves, returning every decade or so for the next 200 years, killing millions more people each time. You might survive the outbreak in 536. But the plague will be back in 547, and again in 555, and again in 565. It becomes a recurring nightmare, a lottery you have to win over and over again to keep living. And here's the darkest part. You're experiencing all of this while already weakened by starvation from the crop failures. Your immune system is compromised. Your body doesn't have the resources to fight off infection effectively. The famine and the plague are synergistic disasters, each making the other worse. Starving people are more susceptible to disease. Sick people can't work to grow food. It's a death spiral, and you're caught in the middle of it. There's no vaccine. There's no antibiotics. There's no understanding of disease transmission that would allow you to protect yourself effectively. You're completely vulnerable, and you know it, and that knowledge is its own kind of torture. You're watching the people around you die, knowing you'll probably be next, knowing there's nothing anyone can do about it. That's what plague in 536 really means. That's the reality behind the statistics. So you're cold, hungry, dying of plague, and you think surely that's enough suffering for 1 year. But wait, there's more, because we haven't even talked about what the weather is doing in different parts of the world, and it's doing some absolutely bizarre things that would be fascinating if they weren't actively killing people. Let's head to China, because China is having an especially terrible time right now, and that's saying something given that everyone is having a terrible time. In China, the yellow dust is falling from the sky, volcanic ash that's traveled thousands of miles on atmospheric currents. People are literally scooping it up in their hands. Handfuls of volcanic ash, trying to figure out what this yellow powder is and where it came from. There's no volcanic eruption in China that anyone knows about, so where is this coming from? It's like the sky is raining dirt, except dirt doesn't usually fall from the sky. But that's just the beginning of China's weather problems. In the summer of 536, something happens that violates every principle of how seasons are supposed to work. Frost falls in summer. Not autumn, not that last surprise cold snap in late spring, but in the middle of summer, when crops should be ripening under hot sun, farmers wake up to find their fields covered in frost, their summer crops killed overnight by freezing temperatures that have no business existing in July or August. Then it snows. In August. Snow. The Chinese chronicles record this with what I can only imagine is absolute bewilderment, because August snow is not a thing that happens in normal years. Your entire understanding of the natural world, passed down through generations of ancestors, is being shattered by weather that seems to follow no rules at all. The gods, the spirits, the natural order, something has gone terribly wrong with the fundamental machinery of the cosmos. The city of Xinzhou is particularly hard hit. The combination of dim sun, falling ash, summer frost, and August snow creates agricultural conditions that can only be described as apocalyptic. Crops fail completely, not partially, not will have a thin harvest, but completely. The growing season has effectively been cancelled by weather that shouldn't exist. And when crops fail completely in an agricultural society with no food reserves and no way to import grain from elsewhere because elsewhere is experiencing the same problems, people starve. The death toll is staggering. Contemporary sources suggest 70 to 80% mortality in Xinzhou and surrounding areas. Think about that for a moment. 8 out of every 10 people you know are dead within 2 years. Your village had 100 people. Now it has 20. Your extended family had 30 members. Now you have 6. The social fabric doesn't just fray. It completely disintegrates because there aren't enough people left to maintain social structures. Who's going to run the government when most of the officials are dead? Who's going to maintain the roads and bridges when the workers have starved? Who's going to defend the border when the soldiers are too weak to fight? China is experiencing a near-total societal collapse in some regions, all because the weather decided to violate the fundamental contract of the seasons. The survivors face a different kind of hell. They're walking through depopulated villages where bodies lie unburied because there aren't enough living people to bury the dead. They're taking over abandoned farms, trying to work land that proved deadly to its previous owners. They're forming new families from the fragments of old ones, orphans and widows combining households out of necessity, because survival alone is nearly impossible. Let's hop over to Peru, because the Moche civilization is having their own apocalyptic encounter with impossible weather, and it's about to fundamentally alter South American history. The Moche are accomplished fishermen. You need to understand. Their entire economy is built around fishing and advanced irrigation agriculture. They've developed sophisticated canal systems that allow them to grow crops in an otherwise challenging environment. They're thriving. Or at least they were until 536 rolled around and decided to destroy everything they've built. An unusually strong El Niño event hits the coast of Peru around this time. El Niño is already bad in normal years, but this one is supercharged, amplified by the global climate chaos. The ocean water warms dramatically, and warm water is terrible for fish. The cold Humboldt Current that normally runs along the South American coast, bringing nutrient-rich water that supports massive fish populations, is disrupted. The fish either die or migrate away, and the Moche economy, which depends on fishing, collapses. But wait, it gets worse. El Niño doesn't just warm the water, it changes the precipitation patterns. Areas that should be dry get massive rainfall. The Moche irrigation system, designed for the normal climate pattern, can't handle the flood of water. Canals overflow, fields flood. The carefully maintained infrastructure that took generations to build is destroyed in weeks by unprecedented rainfall and flooding. Imagine being a Moche farmer or fisherman. Your entire life, your culture has taught you how to read the ocean, how to predict the seasons, how to work with the natural rhythms of your environment. You've inherited knowledge that goes back centuries, knowledge that has always worked, and now it doesn't work. The fish aren't where they should be. The rains come when they shouldn't. The floods destroy your fields. Everything you knew about how to survive in your environment is suddenly obsolete. The Moche civilization never fully recovers from this disaster. The combination of lost fishing stocks, destroyed irrigation systems, and the general climate chaos of the 536 era fundamentally disrupts their society. In the centuries that follow, the Moche decline and eventually disappear as a distinct culture, absorbed by other groups or simply dying out. The year 536 and its aftermath may well have been the beginning of the end for an entire civilization. Back in Europe, the weather is doing its own bizarre things. Rivers are freezing, that rarely freeze. Snow falls in areas where snow is unusual. Growing seasons are shortened at both ends. Late spring frost followed by early autumn frost, creating a narrow window that's barely adequate for crops to mature. And remember, this is all happening while the sun is dim, so even that narrow window doesn't provide adequate warmth and light for normal plant growth. The Baltic Sea, which normally freezes partially in winter, freezes more extensively than usual. This disrupts trade routes, isolates communities, makes it harder to transport what little food is available. Ships that would normally carry goods between ports are trapped by ice, or can't navigate safely through ice flows. The interconnected trade network that helps stabilize food supplies across regions is breaking down, not just because of economic disruption, but because the sea itself is freezing. In Scandinavia, the frost penetrates deeper into the ground than normal, making it hard to dig graves for the dead, which is becoming a problem because there are a lot of dead people who need burying. Permafrost that normally thaws in summer stays frozen, making agriculture even more difficult in an already marginal environment. Some Scandinavian settlements are likely abandoned during this period, people moving south in search of better conditions, only to find that conditions are bad everywhere. Tree ring evidence from this period shows dramatically slowed growth. Trees in Ireland, Siberia, Chile and California all show the same pattern, a sudden decrease in ring width starting in 536. This is unusual because trees in different parts of the world usually show different patterns based on local conditions. But when you see the same pattern globally, it means something big happened to the entire planet's climate simultaneously. That's what the volcanic ash is doing, creating a global cooling event that affects every region. In the Mediterranean, the weather is just wrong. Sailors report strange fogs that persist for days. The water temperature drops noticeably. Fish populations change as species that prefer warmer water migrate away and are replaced by cold water species, disrupting local fishing industries that depend on particular types of fish. Nothing is where it should be, neither in the sky nor in the sea. The Alps see heavy snowfall that persists late into spring and returns early in autumn. Mountain passes that are normally navigable for trade and travel become dangerous or impassable. This further disrupts trade and communication between northern and southern Europe, at a time when those connections are crucial for managing the crisis. Villages in mountain valleys are cut off, isolated, left to survive or die on their own because no help can reach them through the snow. Monsoon patterns in India are disrupted. The monsoon is everything in India. Agriculture depends entirely on those seasonal rains. When the monsoon fails or comes at the wrong time or brings too much water or too little, people die. The climate chaos of 536 is affecting monsoon patterns, which means India is experiencing its own agricultural catastrophe, though historical records from India in this period are limited, so the full extent is unclear. Africa is likely affected too, though again detailed historical records are scarce. The climate of sub-Saharan Africa depends on complex interactions between ocean temperatures, monsoon patterns, and atmospheric circulation, all of which are being disrupted by the volcanic ash. Crops that depend on specific rain patterns are failing, herders watching their animals starve on dried-out grasslands. Communities that survived for centuries in marginal environments are being pushed past their limits. The Middle East, always a challenging environment for agriculture, becomes even more difficult. The Fertile Crescent is becoming less fertile. The complex irrigation systems that allow civilization to exist in Mesopotamia are stressed by changing river flows and rainfall patterns. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which controls much of the Middle East, is dealing with its own climate disasters, weakening it in ways that will have geopolitical consequences in the following century when Arab armies conquer the region. Back to Europe and specifically Ireland, which deserves special mention because Irish historical records are actually relatively good for this period. The Irish annals record the failure of bread in 536, remember, but they also record other strange phenomena. Cattle plagues, likely exacerbated by poor nutrition from inadequate pasture, failed harvests, multiple years in a row, political instability as local kingdoms struggle to maintain authority during crisis. Ireland is suffering, and the normally green landscape is brown, stunted, dying under dim skies. Britain is in similar trouble. This is post-Roman Britain, The legions have withdrawn, and the island is fragmenting into competing kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon settlements, Celtic holdouts, a messy political situation made infinitely worse by climate catastrophe. The legendary King Arthur, if he existed, probably lived around this time, which means the once and future king was dealing with the worst weather in human history, massive crop failures, and probable plague outbreaks. The romantic Arthurian legends conveniently leave out the part where everyone was starving and dying in the dim, perpetual twilight. The thing about global climate catastrophe is that it's not just one disaster. It's thousands of local disasters happening simultaneously, each one a tragedy for the people experiencing it, all of them connected by the same root cause. A volcano explodes in Iceland or El Salvador or possibly both, and the consequences ripple out across the entire planet. Carter. 1. You're living through this, remember? You don't have the big picture. You don't know that everyone everywhere is suffering. You just know your local experience, your personal nightmare, the specific way the weather has betrayed you in your corner of the world. Maybe you're in China watching August snowfall on your dead crops. Maybe you're in Peru watching your fishing nets come up empty. Maybe you're in Ireland eating your last loaf of bread and wondering where the next meal will come from. Different locations, same despair, same slow realization that the world has changed in fundamental ways and might never change back. And throughout all of this, the dim sun persists, that pale disk in the sky, providing light without warmth, brightness without comfort. It's a constant reminder that something is deeply wrong, that nature itself has turned against you. You can adapt to many things. Humans are remarkably adaptable, but you can't adapt to the sun not working properly. The sun is supposed to be the one constant, the reliable foundation of existence. When that fails, everything else falls apart. This is what climate catastrophe looks like from the inside, not abstract graphs and statistics, but lived experience, sensory details, daily suffering. This is what it means when historians write about the late antique Little Ice Age or global cooling event. These clinical terms describe real people freezing, real children starving, real communities dying under impossible weather that violates every rule they thought governed the world. Now let's talk about what daily life actually looks like when you're trying to survive in these conditions, because the big disasters are one thing, but it's the grinding, daily struggles that really break people down. You need to eat. You need to stay warm. You need to maintain some semblance of human dignity while everything falls apart around you. Let's explore exactly how that works, or more accurately, how that doesn't work. You wake up, assuming you managed to sleep despite the cold and hunger and fear. There's no alarm clock, but you don't need one because daybreak, such as it is, provides a dim illumination that eventually becomes bright enough to distinguish objects. Not bright enough to be cheerful or warm, just bright enough to start your day of struggling to survive. You're still alive, which is actually an achievement worth noting. Many people who were alive yesterday are dead today, from plague, from starvation, from the cold, from simple despair. Your first task is fire. You need fire for warmth, for cooking what little food you have, for boiling water that might be contaminated. Building a fire seems simple, but everything is harder when you're malnourished and exhausted, and your hands are stiff from cold. The firewood you gathered yesterday is damp because everything is damp in this dim grey world where nothing properly dries. The tinder doesn't want to catch. The smoke makes you cough, and coughing hurts because your body has no reserves, no buffer against discomfort. The challenge of fire starting in these conditions cannot be overstated. Modern people flip a switch or turn a knob and have instant heat and light. You're working with primitive technology in suboptimal conditions. The flint and steel technique requires striking the flint at exactly the right angle against the steel to produce sparks. Your hands, weakened by hunger and stiff from cold, keep missing the angle. When you do get sparks, they land on damp tinder that refuses to ignite. You go through attempt after attempt, each failure draining your limited energy reserves. Even when you finally get a flame established, maintaining it becomes the next challenge. The wood is damp and wants to smolder rather than burn cleanly. Smoke fills your dwelling, making your eyes water and your lungs burn. You have to constantly tend the fire, adding wood gradually to build up heat without smothering the flames. In your weakened state, even this simple task becomes exhausting. You find yourself taking breaks, sitting and staring at the struggling fire, gathering energy for the next small effort. The smoke from countless struggling fires creates its own atmospheric effects in populated areas. Villages and cities develop a pall of smoke that hangs in the still, cold air, adding to the general greyness and gloom. This smoke contains particulates that further irritate already stressed respiratory systems. People develop what we would call COPD, chronic coughs and difficulty breathing, that never fully resolves. The combination of volcanic ash in the atmosphere and wood smoke at ground level creates air quality that would violate every modern environmental standard. Fire also becomes a social flashpoint as fuel becomes scarce. Forests near settlements are being stripped bare as everyone competes for firewood. Arguments break out over who has rights to gather from which areas. Some landowners begin restricting access to their woodlands, hoarding fuel resources. This creates yet another axis of inequality, where the wealthy can stay warm because they own forested land while the poor freeze because they can't access fuel. The commons, shared resources that everyone traditionally accessed, are being privatized by those with power to enforce exclusion. There's no matches to make this easy. You're using flint and steel, striking them together to create sparks that hopefully, maybe, if you're lucky, will ignite your tinder. Your hands are shaking from weakness and cold, making it harder to get the angle right. 10 minutes pass, 20, half an hour before you finally get a flame established. By the time you have an actual fire going, you've expended energy you can't afford to expend, energy you won't be replacing because you don't have enough food. Breakfast, if you can call it that. Maybe you have some grain left, barely, a handful of barley or wheat that you boil in water to make thin gruel. It's not enough to satisfy, barely enough to keep your stomach from actively gnawing at itself. There's no eggs because the chickens aren't laying. There's no bacon because you ate the pig weeks ago. There's no bread because you don't have enough grain to make bread and fuel to heat the oven. You eat your watery gruel and tell yourself it's better than nothing, which is technically true, but only technically. The psychology of chronic hunger changes how you relate to food fundamentally. In times of plenty, food is about taste, enjoyment, social bonding, tradition. In times of famine, food becomes pure survival calculation. Every mouthful is counted, weighed mentally against future needs. You eat slowly, trying to make the small portion last longer, trying to trick your brain into feeling more satisfied. You chew thoroughly, extracting every possible calorie and nutrient. You scrape your bowl obsessively, making sure not a single grain of gruel is wasted. The social dynamics of eating change dramatically during famine. Meals that were once communal affairs, times for family bonding and conversation, become tense, silent rituals. Everyone watches everyone else, making sure no one takes more than their share. Children learn not to ask for seconds because there are no seconds. Parents skip meals entirely, claiming they're not hungry, so their children can have a bit more. This sacrifice is noble, but ultimately counterproductive, as parents need to maintain strength to work and provide for the family. The constant hunger creates obsessive food thoughts. You find yourself fantasizing about meals from the past, remembering feasts and celebrations with crystal clarity. The memory of a meal from years ago, the taste of roasted meat, fresh bread, ripe fruit, becomes more vivid than recent events. Dreams are filled with food, elaborate banquets that disappear the moment you wake, leaving you more desperately hungry than before. Some people report that the food dreams are worse than nightmares because the contrast between dream abundance and waking scarcity is unbearable. The physiological effects of chronic malnutrition are progressive and insidious. Initially, you feel hunger, weakness, and fatigue. As malnutrition continues, your body begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy, weakening you further. Your immune system becomes compromised, making you vulnerable to infections. Your brain function declines, making it hard to concentrate, remember, or think clearly. Eventually, organ systems begin to fail as your body literally consumes itself, trying to maintain vital functions. The progression from hungry to starving to dying is gradual enough that you might not realize how dire your condition is until it's too late to recover. You need water. The well is communal, which means walking to it, which means expending more energy, which means encountering other people who might be infected with plague. You bring your vessel, a clay pot or wooden bucket, and wait your turn. The woman ahead of you has a racking cough. Is it plague? Is it pneumonia from the cold and damp? Does the distinction matter? You'll be breathing the same air either way. You draw your water, trying not to touch anything others have touched. trying not to think about how many sick people have used this well, this rope, this bucket. The water itself might be contaminated. There's no understanding of waterborne disease, no concept of bacteria or viruses in water. People dump waste too close to water sources because where else are they going to dump it? The river that provides your water also receives human and animal waste from upstream. You might boil the water if you have fuel to spare, or you might not because boiling uses fuel and fuel is scarce. It's a gamble. Drink potentially contaminated water or don't drink enough water at all. Both options can kill you, just in different ways and on different timescales. Work needs to be done, assuming you have the strength to work. If you're a farmer, and most people are farmers, you need to check your fields. Not that there's much to check. Your crops are failing, obviously, but you still go through the motions because what else are you going to do? You walk through your fields, looking at stunted plants that will never produce a decent harvest, pulling a few weeds that are actually growing better than your crops because weeds are hardy like that, trying to convince yourself that maybe things will improve. They won't improve. Deep down you know this. The sun is still dim. The temperature is still wrong. Your crops are doomed. But humans are optimists, especially when the alternative is despair. So you keep tending your dying crops because acknowledging that they're dying would mean acknowledging that you're probably dying too. And that's too much truth for one morning. If you're in a city rather than a rural area, work might mean trying to practice your trade. You're a carpenter? There's less construction happening because people are conserving resources. You're a blacksmith? Fewer people need tools when farming is failing. You're a merchant? Trade has collapsed. There's nothing to buy or sell. Every profession is affected by the general catastrophe. The economy is shutting down because the foundation of the economy, agricultural surplus that allows specialization and trade, no longer exists. Social interactions are fraught with tension. That neighbor who borrowed tools last month and hasn't returned them, you need those tools, and you're pretty sure they're hoarding food. Maybe you should confront them. Maybe you should steal your tools back. Maybe you should report them to whatever authority still exists. But then again, you're hoarding a little food yourself. The last secret handful of grain hidden where your own family doesn't know about it. Your insurance policy if things get even worse. So maybe you shouldn't be throwing stones. Children, if you have any still living, are hungry and whiny, and you have nothing to give them, there's no hiding the reality from children. They can see the empty storage jars, the bare cupboards, the worried expressions on adult faces. They can feel the cold that never seems to go away, no matter how close to the fire they sit. They ask when things will get better, and you lie and say soon, because what else can you say? The truth. That you don't know if things will ever get better. That you might all be dead before next winter is not something you can tell a child. Hygiene is deteriorating. You're not bathing regularly because heating water for a bath uses fuel you can't spare. And besides, getting naked in this cold is dangerous. Your clothes are dirty. Your hair is matted. Your body smells. Everyone smells. The whole village smells like unwashed humans. Smoke, rotting food and fear. There's no soap, or what soap exists is being saved for truly necessary cleaning. Your skin itches. You might have lice. Probably have lice. Everyone has lice. The chronic cold affects everything. Your hands are clumsy. Your fingers don't want to grip properly. Fine motor control becomes difficult. If you're doing any kind of skilled work, it takes longer, requires more concentration. Your joints ache constantly, a deep cold ache that never quite goes away. Older people are suffering especially badly. Arthritis flaring up, old injuries throbbing. Some of them just stay in bed, or whatever passes for bed, conserving energy, waiting to die. Speaking of bed, you don't have a comfortable mattress. You're sleeping on straw maybe, or rough wool, covered with whatever blankets and furs you possess. It's not enough. You pile on everything you own and you're still cold at night. You sleep fitfully, waking frequently from discomfort, hunger, cold or bad dreams. When you do sleep, you dream of fire, of warmth, of the sun as it used to be, bright and hot. You dream of feasts, tables groaning with food. Then you wake up cold and hungry, and the dreams feel like mockery. Evenings are the worst. The dim daylight fades into actual darkness, and night is terrifying. There's no electric lights, no flashlights, just small fires or primitive oil lamps if you can afford oil, which you probably can't. The darkness is oppressive, absolute, full of sounds that might be animals, or might be desperate people, or might be your imagination. You huddle close to your fire if you have one. Tell stories to distract from reality. Try to sleep early because there's nothing else to do, and sleep at least passes the time. Disease is everywhere. Not just plague, but a host of other ailments thriving in the conditions of malnutrition, cold, and poor hygiene. Respiratory infections that would be minor in normal times become life-threatening when you're starving. Dysentery sweeps through communities, dehydrating already weakened people. Skin infections fester. Teeth rot because dental care doesn't exist. And what little food you have might be rough or poorly prepared. Your body is breaking down in a dozen small ways, each minor problem compounding the others. Mental health is collapsing. Depression is rampant. Not the modern clinical kind that can be treated with therapy and medication, but a deep existential despair born of watching everyone around you suffer and die while knowing you're probably next. Anxiety is constant, a low-level panic that never quite goes away. Some people crack entirely, becoming violent or catatonic, and there's no psychiatric care, no understanding of mental illness. They're just left to suffer or locked away or driven out of the community. The concept of hope becomes precious and rare. You hold on to tiny things, a slightly warmer day, a bird singing despite the dim light, a child laughing, even briefly, even through their hunger. These small moments of beauty or normalcy become lifelines, proof that the world hasn't entirely ended, that life continues in small ways even during catastrophe. You cherish these moments because they're all you have. Religion provides comfort for some. Prayers, rituals, the structure of religious observation, belief that there's a divine plan, even if it's incomprehensible, that suffering has meaning, that the faithful will be rewarded eventually. For others, religion feels hollow. Where is God in this? Why would a benevolent deity allow such suffering? Faith is tested. Some people emerge with stronger belief. Others lose faith entirely. Both responses are valid when you're living in hell. The social hierarchy is maintained, barely, through force and inertia. Nobles still claim authority over peasants. Though what good is authority when everyone is starving? The church still collects tithes, though there's little to tithe. The powerful hoard what resources remain, using their position to survive at the expense of those below them. It's not fair, it's not right, but fairness and rightness are luxuries for times when people aren't desperately trying not to die. Some people snap and turn to crime. Theft increases, violence increases. When your children are starving, stealing food starts to seem not just acceptable but necessary, a moral imperative to keep your family alive. Property rights matter less than survival. The normal rules of civilized society fray and break under extreme stress. Guards, if they still exist and haven't died or deserted, are stretched thin and ineffective. And every single day you wake up and do it again. The same struggle, the same suffering, the same grinding effort just to survive one more day. There's no end in sight. The sun is still dim. The cold persists. The food continues to run out. The plague continues to kill. You're not building toward anything. Not working toward a better future. Just enduring, surviving, existing in a state of prolonged crisis that seems like it might be the new permanent reality. This is what daily life means in 536. Not dramatic plague scenes or spectacular disasters, but quiet desperation, grinding poverty, chronic hunger, constant cold, and the slow erosion of everything that makes life worth living. You endure it because the alternative is giving up and dying, and humans have a stubborn refusal to just lay down and die even when everything is terrible. So you keep going, day after miserable day, and maybe you survive and maybe you don't, but either way, 536 is the worst year of your life and possibly the worst year in human history. Let's talk about the political situation, because empires are collapsing and kingdoms are fragmenting, and the climate catastrophe is rearranging the geopolitical map in ways that will echo for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, which really thought it was going to restore Roman glory under Emperor Justinian, is about to discover that plague and famine are more powerful than any army. Justinian had plans, big plans. He wanted to reclaim the Western Roman territories lost to barbarian kingdoms. He wanted to make the empire great again, if you will. And initially things were going well. His general Belisarius was winning victories against the Vandals in North Africa, against the Ostrogoths in Italy. The empire was expanding. Military prestige was rising. Roman power was being restored. And then 536 happened, and everything went to hell. The irony of Justinian's reign is that his ambitions were perfectly reasonable given the circumstances he inherited. The Western Roman Empire had fallen in 476 CE, just 60 years before, well within living memory. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority in the West were often unstable, divided, vulnerable. The military balance favored Byzantium, which maintained professional armies and sophisticated logistics. The reconquest strategy made strategic sense. What Justinian couldn't foresee was that nature itself would intervene to make his plans impossible. The early victories under Belisarius were genuinely impressive. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, which had existed for a century and seemed firmly established, collapsed within a single year of Byzantine invasion in 533. The speed and completeness of victory must have seemed like divine favor, proof that God supported the restoration of Roman unity. Similar early success in Italy against the Ostrogoths reinforced the sense that reconquest was not only possible but inevitable. The momentum was entirely with Byzantium. Then the climate catastrophe struck, and momentum became irrelevant. Armies march on their stomachs, as the saying goes. When food production collapses globally, maintaining military campaigns becomes impossible. Byzantine armies in Italy found themselves in hostile territory during a famine, unable to forage effectively, dependent on supply lines that stretched back across a Mediterranean plagued by the same disasters. The Gothic armies defending Italy were similarly affected, but they had the advantage of fighting on home territory with interior lines of communication. The Gothic Wars, which Justinian expected to win decisively within a few years, dragged on for nearly 2 decades, from 535 to 554. This extended conflict devastated Italy far more thoroughly than any previous barbarian invasion. Armies on both sides foraged aggressively, stripping the countryside of food. Cities were besieged multiple times, their populations starving or dying of disease. The infrastructure of Roman Italy, the roads, aqueducts, public buildings and agricultural systems that had survived relatively intact through the barbarian migrations, was systematically destroyed by 20 years of war, compounded by climate disaster and plague. Here's what nobody tells you about military campaigns. They require logistics. Armies need to eat, soldiers need to be paid, campaigns need supplies, weapons, horses, infrastructure. All of that depends on a functioning economy, which depends on agricultural surplus, which depends on crops growing, which they're not doing because the sun has disappeared and it's freezing in the middle of summer. When your entire economic foundation collapses, your military ambitions collapse with it. The Gothic Wars, Rome's attempt to retake Italy, start to go badly, not because the Roman army suddenly became incompetent, but because they can't maintain supply lines when food doesn't exist to supply. Soldiers are starving right alongside civilians. Units can't maintain full strength when plague is sweeping through their ranks. The grand reconquest grinds to a halt, bogged down in a years-long slog through a ruined landscape where cities are depopulated and fields lie empty. Italy, the heartland of the old Roman Empire, becomes a wasteland. Decades of warfare combined with plague and famine reduce the population dramatically. Cities that survived the fall of Rome, that maintained some level of prosperity and culture, are destroyed more thoroughly by the combination of war and disaster than by any previous barbarian invasion. The Italy that emerges from this period is fundamentally different, poorer, less populated, less urbanized. Justinian himself catches plague, remember. The emperor nearly dies. He survives, but his empire doesn't really. The Plague of Justinian kills somewhere between a third and half of the empire's population over the following decades. That's not just a humanitarian tragedy, it's a fiscal catastrophe. Your tax base just died. Your military recruitment pool just died. Your workforce just died. How do you run an empire when half your people are gone? The empire goes bankrupt, essentially. Justinian tries to maintain military campaigns, tries to keep up appearances, but the resources aren't there. Tax revenue collapses because dead people don't pay taxes, and starving people can't pay taxes. The government starts debasing the currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins, which causes inflation, which makes the economic situation worse. It's a downward spiral from which the Byzantine Empire never truly recovers. The eastern borders are vulnerable now. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Byzantium's traditional rival, is also suffering from the climate disasters and plague, but they're opportunistic enough to take advantage of Byzantine weakness. Conflicts continue, draining resources neither side can afford to spend. Both empires are exhausting themselves fighting each other while literally everything else is falling apart, which is typical of empires, honestly. In the West, the Gothic kingdoms and other barbarian successor states are having their own catastrophes. These are fragile polities, newly formed kingdoms trying to establish legitimacy and stability in post-Roman territories. They're not well equipped to handle massive climate disasters and plague. Some kingdoms collapse entirely, others fragment. Political instability is the norm, as leaders die without clear succession, as rival claimants fight over the remaining resources, as desperate populations rise up against whoever they blame for the disasters. Merovingian Gaul, what will eventually become France, survives but is weakened. The Merovingian dynasty will continue for another 2 centuries, but the disasters of the 536 era contribute to the general fragmentation and weakness that characterizes early medieval France. Central authority is hard to maintain when everyone is focused on local survival. The kingdom becomes a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions, only nominally loyal to the crown. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain is struggling. They're dealing with the same climate issues, the same crop failures, the same plague, but they've also got internal religious conflicts, tensions between the Arian Gothic ruling class and the Catholic Roman population they conquered. Crisis amplifies existing tensions, makes compromise harder, makes violence more likely. Political stability becomes impossible when the foundation of society is crumbling. In Britain, this is probably when the Anglo-Saxon expansion accelerates. The native Celtic kingdoms are weakened by famine and plague, less able to resist Anglo-Saxon settlement. The legendary resistance that might have been led by someone later mythologized as King Arthur is ultimately futile because you can't fight a successful guerrilla war when your population is starving. The Anglo-Saxons, suffering the same disasters, nevertheless have momentum, and momentum matters in warfare, even when everyone involved is simultaneously dying. The Lombards, a Germanic tribe, will invade Italy in 568, just a few decades after our focus year, partially because they're being pressured by other tribes migrating westward, which is happening because climate disruptions in Central Asia are making traditional pastoral lifestyles unsustainable, forcing population movements. The disasters of 536 kick off a chain of migrations and invasions that will reshape European politics for centuries. In China, political instability is rampant during this period. The northern and southern dynasties are in conflict, neither side able to unify the country, both weakened by the catastrophic climate events. The massive death toll from famine in regions like Sinju creates power vacuums, territories where no government has effective control because there's no population left to govern. Whoever eventually reunifies China, and the Sui dynasty will manage it in 589, will rule over a drastically different country, with a much smaller population than existed before 536. The Gupta Empire in India, which had presided over a golden age of art, science and culture, is in decline. The exact reasons are complex, but climate disruptions and probable plague outbreaks certainly don't help. By the mid-6th century, the empire is fragmenting into smaller kingdoms. The cultural and economic integration that the Guptas provided is lost, replaced by political chaos and regional competition. In Persia, the Sassanid Empire is suffering but still powerful. They'll actually benefit in the long run from Byzantine weakness, taking advantage during the early 7th century to conquer Egypt, Syria, and much of Anatolia. But that success is temporary and will set them up for their own catastrophic fall when Arab armies, unified by the new religion of Islam, explode out of Arabia in the 630s and 640s. The Sassanid Empire, already weakened by the disasters of the 6th century, will be unable to effectively resist and will collapse entirely. Nobody in 536 can see the future, of course. Nobody knows that the disasters they're experiencing are setting up the geopolitical transformations of the next century. They're just trying to survive, trying to maintain whatever power and stability they have, making decisions based on incomplete information in the middle of multiple overlapping crises. But historians looking back can see how 536 was a hinge point, a moment when the ancient world truly ended and the medieval world began. The concept of centralized imperial power takes a major hit. Rome had been about integrated governance, professional bureaucracy, regular taxation, maintained infrastructure, the whole package. The successor states tried to maintain that model with varying degrees of success. But when plague kills half your bureaucrats and famine destroys your tax base, and climate disasters break your infrastructure, centralized government becomes nearly impossible. What emerges instead is feudalism, or proto-feudalism, the system where local strongmen control territory and populations, where loyalty is personal rather than institutional, where the king is more a first among equals than an absolute ruler. This is partially a rational adaptation to conditions where central authority simply cannot function effectively over long distances, when communications and transport are disrupted. The church gains power relative to secular authorities. When kings and emperors can't protect their people from famine and plague, when governments collapse or become irrelevant, the church remains. Local bishops and priests, whatever their faults, at least provide some continuity, some structure, some basis for community organization. The medieval church's enormous power has many causes, but the chaos of the 6th century certainly contributed, showing that religious authority could outlast secular power. Trade patterns shift fundamentally. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake with busy trade routes connecting all coasts, becomes more fragmented. Byzantine control of the sea is weakening. Islamic expansion in the 7th century will further disrupt Mediterranean trade. The old networks that moved grain from Egypt to Constantinople, oil from Spain to Rome, luxury goods from the east to wealthy consumers in the west, these networks don't fully recover from the disruptions of the 6th century. Northern Europe, ironically, might actually benefit in relative terms from the disasters. Not because they escaped the climate problems, they don't, but because they had less far to fall. The sophisticated, urbanized, trade-dependent societies of the Mediterranean are more vulnerable to disruption than the simpler, more localized economies of the north. When global trade collapses, being self-sufficient in a small community becomes advantageous. The population losses reshape everything. You can't maintain the same level of civilization with half the population. Cities shrink or are abandoned. Rural areas are depopulated. Skilled knowledge is lost when master craftsmen die without training successors. Literacy declines because there are fewer people with the leisure time to learn reading and writing, and fewer jobs that require it. The level of cultural and technological sophistication declines simply because there aren't enough people to maintain it. This is what historians mean when they talk about the Dark Ages, and why they started when they did. It's not that people suddenly became stupid or forgot everything the Romans knew, though some knowledge was definitely lost. It's that the social and economic conditions necessary to support high culture disappeared when the population collapsed. Hard to maintain a philosophical academy when everyone is struggling to find enough food to eat. Hard to produce illustrated manuscripts when you don't have enough scribes. Hard to build monumental architecture when you don't have enough workers. The psychological impact of living through societal collapse affects how survivors view the world. There's a nostalgia for a lost golden age, a sense that the world used to be better and is now broken, that humanity's best days are behind it. This backward-looking orientation, this sense of loss and decline, permeates medieval culture. It's not an irrational attitude when you're living in the ruins of Roman cities that your society can't build anymore, surrounded by evidence that previous generations achieved things you can't replicate. And all of this, all of the political collapse and economic disruption and cultural decline, traces back at least in part to volcanic eruptions in 536, 540 and 547, environmental catastrophe, leading to crop failure, leading to famine, leading to plague, leading to population collapse, leading to political fragmentation, leading to cultural decline, leading to the Dark Ages. It's all connected, one disaster cascading into another, reshaping human civilization in ways that would persist for centuries. You don't know any of this, of course. You're just trying to survive, wondering why your king can't protect you, why your empire is falling apart, why everything seems to be getting worse. The big picture geopolitical analysis is beyond your knowledge and beyond your concern when you're hungry and cold and scared. But the forces that are destroying empires and reshaping civilizations are the same forces that are making your personal life a daily struggle. You're living history, even if you don't know it. Surviving the worst year to be alive. We should talk about the long-term effects, because this isn't just a bad year that passes and then everything returns to normal. The consequences of 536 echo forward for decades, even centuries. This is when the ancient world truly dies, and the medieval world is born from its ruins. The late antique Little Ice Age persists for over a decade. It's not just 536 that's cold and dim, it's 537, 538, 539, continuing through the 540s. Multiple volcanic eruptions in 540 and 547 reinforce the cooling, keep pumping ash into the atmosphere, maintain the climate disruption. If you're a child in 536, you grow up in a world that's fundamentally colder and darker than the world your parents knew. This becomes your normal, this stunted agriculture and marginal existence. Crop yields remain depressed throughout this period. Even when the sun returns to normal brightness, even when the ash finally settles and the temperatures start to recover, agriculture doesn't immediately bounce back. Soil nutrients have been depleted by years of poor growth. Seed stocks have been consumed. Knowledge has been lost as experienced farmers died. The complex agricultural systems that supported large populations have broken down and take generations to rebuild. The plague comes in waves. The Plague of Justinian isn't a one-time event. It recurs every decade or so for the next 2 centuries, each wave killing hundreds of thousands or millions more people. Populations that were starting to recover from the last outbreak get hit again. Demographics remain depressed. Birth rates can't keep up with death rates. The overall population of the Mediterranean world continues to decline through the 6th and 7th centuries. Genetic evidence suggests that plague becomes endemic in parts of Europe and the Middle East, circulating at low levels even between major outbreaks. This creates a constant background mortality, a persistent drain on population and economic productivity. Communities can't plan for the future when plague might show up next year and kill a third of the village. This uncertainty, this perpetual vulnerability, shapes how people think and behave. The economic recovery takes even longer than the population recovery. Trade networks that collapse don't spontaneously rebuild themselves. Trust between trading partners has been destroyed. The infrastructure of trade, the ships, the ports, the warehouses, the merchants, much of it is gone. When a new generation eventually starts rebuilding trade, they're essentially starting from scratch, recreating systems that once existed but whose details have been lost. Technological regression occurs in many areas. Sophisticated Roman technologies that required specialized knowledge and organized production simply disappear when the social conditions to support them vanish. Concrete construction, which Romans were masters of, is largely lost in Western Europe for centuries. Aqueduct construction and maintenance declines. Road networks deteriorate without systematic upkeep. Future generations will look at Roman ruins and wonder how their ancestors built such marvels, having lost the knowledge themselves. Cultural production suffers. Art, literature, philosophy, the things that make civilization worth having, require surplus resources and leisure time. When everyone is focused on basic survival, culture stagnates. Fewer books are copied, so more ancient texts are lost. Fewer artists can find patronage. Fewer philosophers can devote themselves to thought. The 6th century sees a notable decline in cultural output compared to earlier periods, and this decline persists through much of the early medieval period. Literacy rates decline. Reading and writing were never universal in the ancient world, but there was a reasonably large literate class, people who could conduct business, keep records, read literature. That class shrinks dramatically when the economy collapses, and formal education becomes a luxury most people can't afford. By the 7th and 8th centuries, literacy in Western Europe is largely confined to the clergy. This is a massive loss of human capital that takes centuries to recover. Religious changes accelerate. Christianity had been growing steadily throughout the late Roman period, but the disasters of the 6th century boost its growth. When traditional authority can't protect people, when the old gods or the old philosophical systems can't explain or prevent catastrophe, people turn to new sources of meaning and hope. Christianity, with its promise of a better afterlife and its emphasis on caring for the poor and sick, becomes increasingly attractive. The medieval Christian dominance of Europe has many causes, but the 6th century disasters certainly contributed. In the Islamic world, though Islam won't emerge until the 7th century, the groundwork is being laid. The Arabian Peninsula is affected by the global climate disruption, but it's already a marginal environment, and the tribes of Arabia are adapted to harsh conditions. When Islamic armies explode out of Arabia starting in the 630s, they're conquering territories that are still weakened, still depleted, still recovering from the 6th century catastrophes. The rapid Islamic conquests are enabled in part by Byzantine and Sassanid weakness that traces back to this period. Population genetics shows a bottleneck around this time. When you analyze modern European DNA and trace back ancestral lineages, there's a noticeable decrease in genetic diversity that dates to roughly the 6th century. This is what happens when large percentages of the population die. You lose genetic lineages, and the survivors' genes become proportionally more important to future generations. Every person of European descent today is in a sense descended from 6th century plague survivors, selected for whatever genetic factors help them resist or survive. Archaeological evidence shows massive disruption in settlement patterns. Sites that were continuously occupied for centuries are suddenly abandoned in the 6th century. Cities shrink dramatically, their populations sometimes dropping by 50 to 90%. Rural villages disappear entirely. When archaeologists excavate these sites, they find a clear break in the 6th century, a discontinuity that marks the transition from late antiquity to the early medieval period. The famous Dark Ages aren't just about lack of written records, though that's part of it. They're dark because the material conditions of life genuinely became worse for most people. Living standards declined. Life expectancy dropped. Cultural and technological sophistication decreased. This isn't a value judgment or Eurocentric bias, it's what the evidence shows, and the beginning of this decline can be traced to the catastrophes of the 536 era. It takes until about the 10th or 11th century for European population and economic conditions to really recover to pre-disaster levels. That's roughly 400 to 500 years of recovery time. Think about that for a moment. The consequences of a few volcanic eruptions in the 530s and 540s echo forward for half a millennium. That's the power of systemic collapse, where one disaster triggers cascading failures that take centuries to rebuild. For you living through 536, the long-term consequences are abstract. You're not thinking about how this will affect civilization in 200 years. You're thinking about whether you'll survive until tomorrow. But your suffering is part of a larger story. A pivotal moment when human history pivoted, when the ancient world ended and the medieval world began. You're living through one of those rare historical moments that fundamentally changes everything, even if you can't see it from your limited perspective of just trying not to starve or freeze or die of plague. The survivors, the people who make it through the 536 disasters and the following decades of recurring catastrophe, are the ancestors of everyone who comes after. They're the ones who rebuild, slowly, painfully, creating the medieval world from the ruins of antiquity. Their trauma, their suffering, their hard-won survival shapes the culture and society of subsequent generations. You can trace threads from 536 forward through centuries of European, Middle Eastern and global history. And here's the strange thing, despite everything, despite all the death and suffering and collapse, humans persist. Civilization survives in altered form, culture continues, people fall in love, have children, tell stories, create art, build communities. The human capacity for resilience, for finding meaning and joy, even in terrible circumstances, for rebuilding after disaster. That capacity is demonstrated over and over by the survivors of 536 and their descendants. But that doesn't make 536 any less terrible for the people living through it. That doesn't make your suffering any less real, your hunger any less painful, your fear any less valid. You're experiencing the worst year in human history, and the fact that civilization eventually recovers doesn't help you right now, doesn't feed your children, doesn't bring back your dead family members, doesn't warm you against the cold or heal you from plague. So yes, the long-term effects matter to historians studying this period from comfortable modern offices. But to you, the long-term effects are irrelevant compared to the immediate crisis of survival. You'll never know what historians will write about this year. You'll never know that scientists will identify 536 as uniquely terrible. You'll just know your own experience, your own suffering, your own desperate struggle to survive one more day in the worst year to be alive. Let's take a moment to appreciate what you don't have in 536 that modern people take completely for granted, because sometimes the horror of a historical period is best understood through contrast with modernity. You don't have weather forecasts, so the bizarre climate is completely inexplicable. Modern meteorologists could tell you about volcanic ash and global cooling, but you just have a dim sun and cold temperatures with no explanation beyond God is angry or the world is ending. You don't have modern medicine, no antibiotics for the plague, no vaccines to prevent it, no understanding of bacterial infection or immune system function. When you get sick, you have prayer, superstition, and treatments that range from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting doesn't cure plague, it just makes you weaker. Applying heated onions to buboes doesn't kill bacteria, it just adds onion smell to the pus smell. You're medically helpless. You don't have modern agriculture, no mechanized farming equipment, no chemical fertilizers, no hybrid seeds optimized for yield, no irrigation systems beyond primitive channels. You're farming with hand tools, animal power, and knowledge passed down through generations. When that knowledge proves inadequate for unprecedented climate conditions, you have no backup plan. No agricultural extension service is going to show up with advice on cold weather varieties. You don't have food storage and preservation beyond salting, drying, and root cellars. No canning, no refrigeration, no freezing. When crops fail, you can't just buy food shipped from elsewhere because there is no elsewhere. Everyone's crops failed. No global food market. No emergency grain reserves maintained by competent government agencies. When the local food runs out, you starve, period. You don't have rapid communication. News travels at the speed of a walking human or a horse. If something important happens in Constantinople, you might hear about it weeks or months later, or never. You can't coordinate responses to the crisis across regions because you can't communicate effectively across regions. Each community is essentially isolated, dealing with local manifestations of global problems without understanding that they're global problems. You don't have scientific understanding of what's happening. No volcanology explaining the ash. No climatology explaining the cooling. No epidemiology explaining the plague. No one can tell you what caused this, or when it will end, or how to protect yourself effectively. You're operating on superstition, folklore, and wild guesses. Some of those guesses are right by accident, but most are wrong, and you have no way to tell which is which. You don't have human rights or social safety nets. If your lord decides to hoard all the food and let the peasants starve, that's his prerogative. If the authorities decide you're a useful scapegoat to blame for the disasters, they can execute you without anything resembling due process. There's no democracy, no voting rights, no legal protections for common people. You have whatever rights and protections your social superiors choose to grant you, which might be none. You don't have literacy unless you're clergy or high nobility. Most people can't read or write, can't access whatever written knowledge exists, can't record their own experiences for posterity. Your suffering is experienced personally and may be shared orally with your immediate community, but it's not documented, not studied, not understood in any systematic way. You're historically invisible, except as statistics, numbers of dead, estimates of population decline. You don't have hope based on historical precedent. Humans in modernity know that disasters end, that societies recover, because we have historical examples. We've seen nations rebuild after wars, economies recover from depressions, cities rebuilt after destruction. You don't have that knowledge. For all you know, this is the permanent new reality, or even the end of the world. The psychological burden of not knowing if things will ever improve is immense. You don't have modern law enforcement or justice systems. Crime is punished harshly when it's punished at all, but enforcement is sporadic and often arbitrary. When social order breaks down under stress, there's no professional police force to maintain it, just local strongmen with their armed followers. Justice is whatever the powerful say it is. Protection is what you can provide yourself, or what you can pay someone stronger to provide. You don't have modern sanitation, no sewage systems, no water treatment plants, no garbage collection. Human waste is dumped in pits or rivers, or just thrown in the street. Water sources are contaminated. Garbage rots wherever it's discarded. The smell of human habitation is overwhelming by modern standards. A miasma of excrement, rot, unwashed bodies and smoke. This isn't just unpleasant. It's a major contributor to disease transmission. You don't have indoor plumbing. Want water? Walk to the well and carry it back in heavy containers. Need to relieve yourself? Use a chamber pot that needs to be emptied, or walk to an outhouse or designated area. In winter, in the cold and dark, this is miserable. When you're weak from hunger and sickness, even these basic tasks become exhausting challenges. You don't have artificial lighting beyond candles and oil lamps, which are expensive and provide minimal illumination. After dark, You're basically trapped inside your dwelling, or fumbling around in near-total darkness. The long nights of winter are especially oppressive when you can't afford to burn lights for more than an hour or two. You go to bed when it gets dark, because what else is there to do? You don't have modern clothing or textiles. Your clothes are handmade from rough wool or linen, uncomfortable, scratchy, and inadequate for the cold. There's no synthetic insulation, no waterproof materials, no elastic or zippers or Velcro. Getting dressed is a production involving multiple layers of wraparound garments held in place with ties and pins. Your clothes are probably ill-fitting because custom-tailored clothing is expensive and most people make do with roughly sized garments. You don't have pain relief beyond alcohol, and maybe opium if you're wealthy and lucky. Chronic pain from hunger, cold, injuries and disease is just something you endure. No aspirin, no ibuprofen, no local anesthetics. If you need a tooth pulled or a limb amputated, you experience the full horror of pre-anesthetic surgery. Many people prefer to suffer with an infected tooth than undergo the agony of extraction. You don't have dental care. Your teeth are rotting, causing constant pain and difficulty eating, further compounding your malnutrition. Tooth loss is common and expected. By middle age, if you survive to middle age, you'll probably be missing multiple teeth, making eating difficult, affecting your speech, marking you as poor because rich people can afford better diets that preserve teeth longer. You don't have eyeglasses if you need vision correction. If you're nearsighted, farsighted, or develop presbyopia as you age, too bad. Your ability to do detail work, to see hazards, to function effectively, is permanently compromised. This isn't just inconvenient, it's economically devastating because your ability to work is impaired. You don't have accurate timekeeping, no clocks, no watches. Time is measured by the sun's position, by church bells, if you're near a church wealthy enough to have bells, by vague conventions like morning and afternoon. Coordinating activities is difficult. Measuring work hours is imprecise. The modern conception of time as divided into precise hours and minutes doesn't really exist for you. You don't have entertainment beyond what you and your community create yourselves. No books unless you're wealthy. No theatre unless you're in a large city. No recorded music. No visual media of any kind. Entertainment is storytelling, singing, simple games, religious festivals. In times of crisis, when people are too tired and hungry for festivities, entertainment basically disappears. Your life is work, survival, and sleep. You don't have personal privacy. Most people live in small, crowded dwellings with their extended family. Private bedrooms are for the wealthy. You sleep, eat, argue, get sick, give birth, and die in the same room as everyone else in your household. Personal space is not a concept that exists for you. This intensifies every conflict, makes every illness everyone's problem, removes any refuge from stress. You don't have certainty about anything beyond the immediate present. Will you eat tomorrow? Don't know. Will you be alive next week? Don't know. Will your children survive? Don't know. This uncertainty, this inability to plan or predict or control even basic aspects of your life, is psychologically devastating in ways that are hard for modern people to fully comprehend. Most importantly, you don't have the knowledge that this will end. Modern people living through disasters, even terrible ones, generally know that recovery is possible because we've seen it before. You don't have that reassurance. For all you know, this dim sun and cold and hunger and plague will last forever, or until everyone is dead, whichever comes first. The lack of hope, the inability to see light at the end of the tunnel, that might be the worst part of all. This is what historians mean when they talk about material conditions, quality of life, historical context. These aren't just abstract concepts, they're the concrete reality of daily existence. They're the thousand small and large ways your life in 536 is worse than a modern life. The accumulation of suffering and deprivation and vulnerability that makes this genuinely the worst year to be alive. As we reach the end of our journey through this nightmare year, let's talk about the few, the lucky, the survivors who somehow made it through. Because some people did survive, obviously, or we wouldn't be here having this conversation. The human capacity for survival in impossible conditions is remarkable, even if the cost of that survival is almost unbearable. If you made it through 536, if you survived the dim sun and the hunger and the cold and the plague, you're one of the lucky ones, though lucky might feel like the wrong word for someone who watched most of their family die. But you're alive, and being alive counts for something. You've proven that you have whatever combination of good health, good genes, good luck, and sheer stubborn will to live is required to survive the unsurvivable. The randomness of survival is both comforting and disturbing. You can't point to a specific decision or action that saved you. Maybe you had a naturally robust immune system that fought off plague when others succumbed. Maybe you were slightly better nourished going into the crisis, giving you a buffer others lacked. Maybe you just didn't encounter infected fleas. Maybe divine intervention, if you believe in that. The lack of clear causation means you can't take full credit for surviving, but it also means you can't be fully blamed if you made morally questionable choices along the way. Survivor identity becomes central to how you understand yourself. You're not just a farmer or a merchant or whatever your pre-536 identity was. You're a survivor of the worst year in human history, a person who endured and outlasted catastrophe. This identity brings both pride and burden. Pride that you were strong enough, resilient enough, stubborn enough to keep living. Burden because survival came at a cost, required compromises and sacrifices, and witnessed horrors that will never completely fade. The physical scars of 536 mark you permanently. If you had plague and survived, you carry the pitted scars where buboes formed and burst. These scars are visible proof of your ordeal, marks that other survivors recognize it immediately. You're underweight, your body composition altered by prolonged malnutrition. Your muscles have atrophied, requiring months of adequate nutrition and work to rebuild. Your teeth are damaged by years of nutritional deficiency, and perhaps eating things you shouldn't have eaten. Your hair might be thinner, having fallen out during the worst of the starvation. These physical markers identify you as someone who endured, who bears the marks of survival on your body. The emotional scars run deeper, and are less visible, but no less permanent. You've seen things no one should see, experienced losses no one should experience, made choices no one should have to make. You carry memories that intrude at unexpected moments, flashbacks to the worst days, faces of people you loved who didn't survive. These memories don't fade, don't diminish with time. They remain sharp and painful, capable of overwhelming you even years later when something triggers them unexpectedly. Post-traumatic growth is a modern psychological concept, but the phenomenon itself is timeless. Some survivors find that having faced the worst and survived gives them a perspective and strength they didn't have before. Small problems that would have seemed important in 535 are revealed as trivial by comparison to actual existential threats. The pettiness of normal life, the social dramas and status competitions that preoccupy people in stable times, seem ridiculous when you've watched people die of starvation. This perspective can be liberating, allowing you to focus on what actually matters, but it can also create distance from people who didn't experience what you experienced. What does survival look like? You're probably scarred, physically and emotionally. If you had plague and survived, you might have scars from the buboes that burst and healed. You're definitely malnourished, underweight, weakened by years of inadequate food. Your immune system is compromised, making you vulnerable to future diseases. Your bones might be brittle from calcium deficiency. Your organs might be damaged from the stress of prolonged starvation and illness. Emotionally, you're carrying trauma that will never fully heal. You've watched people die in ways no one should have to watch. You've made impossible choices about who to help and who to abandon. You've experienced fear at depths most humans never touch. You've discovered things about yourself, both good and bad, that you wish you didn't know. That knowledge, that experience, changes you permanently. But you're alive, and life has a way of asserting itself even after catastrophe. The sun, slowly, gradually, returns to normal. The ash settles. Temperatures start to recover. It takes years, but eventually the climate begins to resemble what you remember from before 536. The growing season lengthens. Crops improve. Food becomes more available. Not abundant, but adequate, which feels like luxury after years of hunger. The plague eventually recedes. At least this outbreak does. It will return, but for now, new cases become rare, and then stop altogether. The fear that dominated every interaction begins to ease. People start touching each other again, gathering in groups, resuming something like normal social relations. The dead are buried, the mass graves are covered over, and life continues because it has to. The ending of a plague outbreak doesn't happen dramatically. There's no announcement. No clear moment when you know it's over. New cases just become gradually less frequent. Days pass without anyone new falling sick. then a week, then 2 weeks. People start cautiously hoping that maybe, finally, the plague has burned itself out. But everyone remembers false hopes from earlier, times when the plague seemed to be fading only to roar back with renewed intensity. So the optimism is guarded, tentative, always ready to transform back into fear if someone develops symptoms. The psychological transition from plague time to post-plague is difficult. You've spent months or years in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring yourself and others for symptoms, avoiding contact, living in fear. Relaxing that vigilance doesn't happen quickly or easily. The first time you shake someone's hand without flinching, the first time you attend a gathering without calculating infection risks, the first time you trust that a fever is just a fever and not the beginning of plague, these are significant milestones in recovery. Rituals of purification and renewal mark the transition to post-plague life in many communities. Churches hold special services of thanksgiving for the plague's end. Entire villages participate in cleansing rituals, burning contaminated materials, whitewashing buildings, purifying wells and water sources. These rituals serve practical purposes in improving sanitation, but they're primarily psychological and spiritual, ways of marking that the plague time is over and a normal life can resume. But normal life can't truly resume because too much has changed. The social landscape is radically altered by mass death. Every family has losses. Every community has gaps where people used to be. The young man who would have inherited his father's workshop died of plague at 15. The gifted healer who knew all the traditional remedies died treating plague victims. The skilled blacksmith, the talented musician, the wise elder, all gone. Not just numbers, not just statistics, but specific, irreplaceable individuals whose deaths leave permanent holes in the community fabric. Communities begin to rebuild, slowly, tentatively. Fields that went unplanted are planted again. Workshops that closed reopen. Trade that ceased resumes on a limited scale. It's not a dramatic recovery, not a triumphant bounce back. It's a grinding, difficult process of putting one foot in front of the other, doing the work that needs doing, slowly accumulating small improvements that eventually add up to recovery. The rebuilding process reveals both the strengths and limitations of pre-modern societies. On one hand, people are remarkably adaptable and resilient, able to resume agricultural and craft production even after catastrophic losses. The basic knowledge of how to farm, how to work metal, how to build, survives even when many individual practitioners die. On the other hand, the loss of accumulated expertise and refined techniques represents a permanent step backward in many fields. The master craftsman who died took skills to his grave that his journeyman apprentice who survived never fully learned. Agriculture recovery is hampered by more than just labor shortages. Fields that went uncultivated for years become overgrown with weeds and scrub. Irrigation systems that fell into disrepair require extensive work to restore. Draft animals that died or were slaughtered need to be bred up again. A process that takes years since you can't use pregnant cows for heavy work and calves need years to mature. The cascade of dependencies in agricultural systems means that recovery is slow and requires sustained effort across multiple growing seasons. Social reorganization happens organically, as survivors form new households and communities. Widows and widowers remarry, often matching up based on economic necessity rather than romantic attachment. A widow with young children needs a husband who can work the fields and provide. A widower with a farm needs a wife to manage the household and help with agricultural tasks. These pragmatic marriages might lack the emotional intensity of first marriages, but they serve essential survival functions and sometimes develop into genuine partnerships. Orphans present a particular challenge during the recovery. With so many deaths, there are children without parents, without any close relatives, without anyone obligated to care for them. Some communities organize collective care, rotating orphans between households, or establishing them in abandoned dwellings with older children caring for younger ones. Some monasteries and churches take in orphans, raising them in religious institutions. Others survive on the streets through begging, theft, and mutual support networks of orphaned children. The luckier orphans are informally adopted by families who see them as additional labor and future security. You might form new relationships, new families, to replace what was lost. Widows and widowers remarry out of necessity, and maybe even love. Orphans are adopted into surviving families. New children are born, and those children represent hope, proof that life continues. that the future exists even after everything seemed to end. Those children won't remember 536. They'll only know the recovery period, and that's a mercy. Knowledge from the old world is preserved in fragments. Some books survived, some skills were passed on, some traditions maintained. It's not everything. Much has been lost forever, but it's enough to build on. The recovery isn't about restoring what was. It can't be. Too much has changed. It's about creating something new from the ruins, adapting to new realities, finding ways forward even when the old paths are gone. The survivors develop resilience that becomes cultural. You don't take anything for granted anymore, because you've seen how quickly everything can be taken away. You don't waste food because you remember starving. You don't take the sun for granted because you remember when it disappeared. This awareness, this hard-won wisdom becomes part of how you teach your children to see the world. There's a strange gratitude that comes with survival. Not happiness exactly, not joy, but a deep appreciation for being alive, for having food, for seeing the sun shine properly. Small pleasures become profound. A warm day, a good meal, a child's laughter. These things that would have been unremarkable before 536 are now precious. Gifts you don't deserve but received anyway. The survivors also carry guilt. Why did you live when others died? Was it random chance, genetic lottery, divine will, or something about your choices and actions? You'll never know for sure, and not knowing is its own burden. Survivor's guilt is a recognized phenomenon in modern psychology. But in 536, you just have the weight of continued existence while those you loved are gone. Memory becomes important. You tell stories about the people who died, keeping them alive in the only way you can. You maintain their graves if they have them. You pass on their names, their deeds, their existence to the next generation. It's a way of honoring them, of insisting that their lives and deaths mattered, that they're not just statistics in a catastrophic year. Some survivors find renewed faith, interpreting their survival as divine intervention, proof that God has plans for them. Others lose faith entirely, unable to reconcile a benevolent deity with the suffering they witnessed. Both responses are valid. Both are ways of making meaning from chaos, of creating narrative from random catastrophe. The world you inhabit after 536 is fundamentally different from the world before. Political structures have changed. Populations have shifted. The economy operates differently. But you adapt because humans are adaptable, because the alternative is giving up and dying, and you didn't survive the worst year in history just to give up during the recovery. In quiet moments, maybe rare moments when you're alone and feeling safe, you remember the dim sun, the hunger, the fear, the dying. You remember specific moments, specific people, specific horrors that will never leave you. Those memories are painful, but they're also proof that you lived through something extraordinary, that you survived what many didn't, that your life has weight and meaning precisely because you endured the unendurable. And slowly, year by year, life gets better. Not good, maybe never fully good by pre-536 standards, but better than the worst. The trajectory is upward, hesitantly, with setbacks, but generally upward. That's all you can ask for, really. Progress, recovery, small steps toward a future that once seemed impossible. Your children or your community's children will inherit a world shaped by 536, but they won't fully understand it. They'll hear stories about the year the sun disappeared, about the great dying, about the time of darkness, but it will be history to them, not lived experience. That's okay. That's actually good. Each generation deserves to face its own challenges without being crushed by previous generations' trauma. The recovery continues long after you're gone. The work you started, the rebuilding you participated in, continues through decades and centuries. Eventually, civilization reaches and then surpasses the heights it achieved before 536. New empires rise, new cultural achievements occur, new technologies are developed. The catastrophe becomes a story, then a legend, then a footnote in history books, until modern scientists discover the ice core evidence and realize just how terrible that year really was. But none of that future matters to you right now, as you settle down for sleep in this comfortable modern bed, in this warm modern room, with food security and medical care and all the things people in 536 would consider miracles. You've journeyed through the worst year in human history. experienced vicariously what it meant to be alive when everything went wrong simultaneously. You felt the cold, the hunger, the fear, the despair, and now you can let that go. You can appreciate the profound privilege of not living in 536, of inhabiting a world with artificial light, central heating, modern medicine, abundant food, and a sun that rises every day bright and warm. You can appreciate that whatever challenges you face, they're unlikely to include volcanic winters, bubonic plague, and societal collapse all at once. So as you drift off to sleep, warm and safe and fed, take a moment to appreciate the simple fact of being alive in a time and place where survival isn't a daily struggle. Remember the people of 536 who fought so hard to stay alive, who endured so much, who survived so that their descendants eventually could have easier lives. Honor their suffering by appreciating what you have. The year 536 was the worst year to be alive. You've walked through it, witnessed it, understood it in ways that statistics and dates can never convey. The knowledge is heavy, but it's also valuable, a reminder of both human vulnerability and human resilience, of how bad things can get and how people survive anyway. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history's darkest year. I hope you learnt something, felt something, understood something new about the past and the present. May your dreams be peaceful, your sleep deep, and your tomorrow bright with the sun that the people of 536 watched disappear and eventually return. Good night.